What's going on, guys? Can you hear me? Yeah, no clips today. I found one at the last minute, but it was too late. It was one of my subscribers sent me a thing from Clyburn that is ludicrous, but it's too late for that. I'm just gonna read his words. So yeah, no clips.
One minute.
Thank you.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And live again from the divided states of America, it is time now for another 3 hours of the most disruptive show in American politics. In the politically independent corner, I am radio show host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And let's get straight into it. We have the headlines first up, then we have Jamarl's monologue next. We repeat those headlines, by the way, at 8 and 9 a.m. without Jamarl's monologue. We also are taking calls in this next segment, so do feel free to call in. 202-521-1320 is the number. But without further ado, let's get into the headlines. Presidential candidate Joe Biden, vice presidential candidate Kamala Harris appeared together in Delaware as running mates for the first time yesterday, with Harris attacking Trump over the coronavirus, saying that the reason the coronavirus has hit the U.S. harder than any other developed country is because of Trump's failure to take it seriously from the start. That last part is a quote. The Biden campaign said it raised $26 million in one day following his announcement that Harris would be his VP pick. And 538, the website, Nate Silver's website, which got the 2016 election wrong. But anyway, 538 is currently saying Biden has a 72% chance to win the election. They're a relatively trusted source when it comes to this stuff. And that margin appears to be growing as time grows with it. And then in our next story, related, of course, Trump has said he's looking forward to the debate between Vice President Pence and Vice Presidential candidate Harris, saying that it should be better than Pence's debate with Tim Kaine, which was in Pence's favor by most accounts. In our next story, a continuation of the president's policies, also of what Kamala Harris was criticizing him over, the decision to switch to a new reporting system for COVID cases has proven disruptive. Many are reporting serious delays in the public release of hospital data nearly a month after the federal government ordered states to report directly to the Department of Health and Human Services, bypassing the CDC. And reportedly, important data, like the number of beds occupied by coronavirus hospital patients, is now lagging by a week or more. Again, that's very bad. You need those barometers to sort of measure where you are in any crisis, and in any state, anything that you want control over, for that matter. But with the coronavirus specifically, you need to know how many beds you have. If you see a sudden uptick in a week, you might need to start making preparations for that. Anyway, this is if this is true, things are not going well there. And a continuation of this, the head of the CDC, which was bypassed, that's Director Robert Redfield, has issued a dire request asking people to follow 4 steps or risk, quote, the worst fall from a public health perspective we've ever had, end quote. Those 4 steps are to wear a mask, social distance, wash your hands, and be smart about crowds. That is all, almost all of that's a quote. Again, that's coming from CDC Director Robert Redfield. The new head of the EPA under the Trump administration is today set to reverse Obama-era regulations on greenhouse gas emissions, specifically on the release of methane. The new rule eliminates requirements that oil and gas companies must install technology to detect and fix methane leaks from wells, pipelines, and storage sites, which new EPA officials say is needed to free the oil and gas industry from crippling regulations. You might want to come back to that, Jamarl. In our next story, damage assessments are continuing in the Midwest in the aftermath of this week's windstorms. Many farmers lost their crops, with Iowa and Illinois hit the hardest. And while the Illinois Farm Bureau says that it's too early to estimate crop losses, many fields are reportedly completely flattened, with damage to structures also widespread. There have also been reports of widespread infrastructure damage in the states. And in my last story today, Sheriff Billy Woods of the Marion County Sheriff's Office, key circumstances when they're at the courthouse, schools, hospitals, and while on patrol, and responding to a nursing home, or involving a, quote, high-risk elderly individual, end quote. In an email sent to his department on August 11th, Sheriff Woods wrote, "The fact is, the amount of professionals that give the reason why we should, I can find the exact same amount of professionals that say why we shouldn't. Wear masks, that is." This came as Marion County reported 13 deaths on Tuesday alone, its own single-day record. You are all caught up. That is the news. Those are the headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Jamarl, what is your top priority today?
You know, it's funny. My top priority started as one thing, but changed. But I'm realizing that both are the same. The Democratic Convention is coming up. Now, this is going to be, typically it was supposed to be in Milwaukee, but instead it's going to be people doing keynote speeches and so forth. Now, the people who are doing the speeches has been mostly announced, even though it's somewhat fluid. John Kasich, Republican governor of Ohio, at least former governor of Ohio, will be getting a full speaking spot. AOC, lefty firebrand, will be getting 60 seconds. I think that's indicative of something. On top of that, and I would like to also frame within the same framing, even though it may seem differently outside looking too far away from it, something that is also within the same frame and is almost for the exact same reason that it's taking place. Kamala Harris gets the VP spot. Now, Clyburn, Biden speaker Clyburn, says this. He says, we are doing what's necessary to get beyond the whole notion that the Democratic Party takes blacks for granted. The whole notion that black women would not be appreciated, that immigrants ought to stay outside, he said. Later on, we are in a position in this country that a lot of us thought we'd never see. Black Lives Matter. The whole movement has taken hold of the country, he said. People are rallying to the call. And so I believe this campaign is doing the same thing. Now, what Clyburn is talking about is Joe Biden choosing Kamala Harris. And let's also remember, Black Lives Matter, what's their key call? If you can't think of anything else that Black Lives Matter stand for, defund the police. And the person Biden chooses is a top cop. And Clyburn is like, yeah, that's what we need in this country, a top cop. Because, Black Lives Matter is taking off, and I never thought I'd see this moment. Kamala Harris was not favored by blacks during the race. As a flat fact, they could have chosen her. They had the ability to choose her. Cory Booker was in the race. Kamala Harris was in the race. Other people of color were in the race. African Americans chose not her. Now, they ended up choosing Biden, and to be honest, you could say a break between Biden and Sanders because it was going to be one or those two. Those were the 1 and 2 in regards to the people who were pulling in the African American vote. So how weird is it to come to this odd conclusion that, yeah, blacks didn't choose her, but they wanted her for the number 2 spot, so this is doing it for blacks. And this gets across that blacks are not being taken for granted by the Democratic Party. How ludicrous on both counts. The idea that a good portion of your party, 50%, 49%, or 48%, let's be generous, are lefties. Beyond those people identifying themselves as lefties, let's say 45%, the overwhelming majority of that party wanted policy. Do you want Medicare for all? Yes. Do you want an expansion of Social Security? Yes. Do you want a wealth tax? Yes. Do you want the elimination of student debt and free public schools? Yes. Do you want those things? Do you want a Green New Deal? Yes! Yes! We were all those things. And then you get to the second question of who is going to give you those things? And nobody had the belief that Joe Biden would give those things. Kamala Harris, who started off giggling her way, surprising her staff, talking about Medicare for all, of course, backed away from it pretty quickly. I guess the point that I'm making here is the public wanted something very specific, and it was policy. Now, if you ask the public a secondary question of who do you think is more electable, that's a second question. But what do you want? What do you think needs to be affected in the world? That's before COVID-19. And that's where the public was like, yes, we want these things. Now, the secondary question is, who do you think is more electable? And that's where the public hit his head. Because despite Joe Biden being considered more electable because he's just the typical Democrat that people are familiar with, that's more of a relative distinction, not necessarily a real thing. But he is the normal Democrat. And Bernie Sanders wasn't going to make an argument over the notion of electability. He wasn't even going to make an argument tying who Joe Biden is to basically everything that people hate about the Democratic Party. He wasn't going to do any of that. And so basically, Joe Biden was able to just stumble over the finish line to win the nomination. The point I'm getting here, though, is if you have that many of your people in your party that either backs those policies or, for that matter, identify with these kind of lefty ideas, then the idea that you would have AOC, who is looked widely upon as being the up-and-coming lefty, to get 60 seconds tells you everything about how you view the left and the Democratic Party. The reality of it is that the Democratic Party doesn't need to regard the left of much of anything, because ultimately the left, just like the last 40 years, have nowhere else to go, which means that in a wave election where the arc of history is screaming to be bent, Joe Biden gets the choice. Joe Biden gets the nod. The guy who would not bend it, who said that everything basically will stay the same, and further, who set up the entire criminal justice system that all of these people are out there protesting right now. Joe Biden. That's the guy who was chosen. And AOC, the person who ideologically the party agrees with. 60 seconds. If you want to know how little the party regards you, right there. Why do you think they put Kasich in that spot? They put Kasich in that spot because they realize that people who are voting for Kasich can go elsewhere. Meaning, the argument of you have nowhere else to go doesn't work for the Kasich voter. That doesn't necessarily work for the Clinton-type Democrat because those people can go elsewhere. You have more people who voted for John McCain that was voting for Clinton under Obama than what for Sanders and voted for Trump. Those people had somewhere else to go. And that's the key point here. The Kasich voters, the Republican Democrat, if you want to call it that, those people could float one way or the other. And so Democrats will make a pitch, it will make a call, it will make a play to get those voters. Lefties have nowhere else to go. So they'll get their 60 seconds and they'll call it a day. The key here, though, is in the same way that lefties are in this kind of weird box of you have nowhere else to go, or Hispanics, you have nowhere else to go, or blacks, you have nowhere else to go. And so regardless of what the Democrat does, regardless of the policies that they push, even if you don't support those policies, you're voting for them, not because of what they're pushing, but because of who they're keeping out of office. Meaning the best that you can get from the Democratic Party, if you're a lefty, or for that matter, if you're an African American, is we will keep this other guy out of office. Don't ask or expect anything from us, though. Clyburn probably heard the call, just like a lot of Democrats probably heard the call, that blacks are taken for granted. Blacks are taken for granted because politically, they set themselves up to be. If you're voting for somebody to the tune of 90-something% and you get nothing out of it, why would they give you anything? What do you think politics is? Something that they give away? No, voting is a transactional process. The reason that the rich give so much money into the political process is because they get things back for that. You don't have the cash. You have your vote. You have your energy. You have dollars or pitchforks. And for the longest time, the pitchforks have been sitting in the barn somewhere. I'm saying that the dollars have had the run of the roost, and that in order to assuage your sensibilities, in order to get across to you that, look, I know you're not getting the policies that you want. I know you're not getting the things that you want that materially benefit you and your community. At the very least, he's not a Republican. At some point, that should not be enough. Obama gave 95% of the income gains to the top 1%. His black face didn't stop him from doing that. The notion that you're going to put Kamala Harris in that spot is purely identitarian reasons, not for issues of policy. It's not, hey, African Americans are dying 3-1. We got to get Medicare for all, so we're putting this person in to make sure that policy goes through. Nope, off the table. It's not, you have this huge group of people who could free themselves to some degree if they had a freedom of education, meaning free colleges and schools. For that matter, even the wealth tax and the way that the money could be reinvested into the community. Those are things that materially benefit your community. And those are things that are off the table. And instead, they're giving you a black face, as if that black face should substitute for the real material items that you need, and it will be in the best interest of your community. I don't care if you choose Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is not NOT, indicative of blacks not being taken for granted in the Democratic Party. It is the opposite of that. It is the triumph of that. And more importantly, as I said yesterday, the triumph of spectacle. The notion that you could choose somebody who just because they're look black, that is in and of itself enough from the standpoint of policy, is appalling. And I'm sorry, Clyburn can say whatever Clyburn wants. I don't want to curse there. But Clyburn can say whatever Clyburn wants. Clyburn is a Democrat, and Clyburn is trying to assuage the African-American angst that they are just being taken for granted, and they have been for the last 40, 50 years. It should not assuage that angst. It should affirm that angst. If she is not going to do something that is materially beneficial from the standpoint of policy that is going to benefit you and your own and your family members, her blackface doesn't matter. And let me end here, because I'm getting annoyed by this. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment for Shane's response.
Fault Lines.
So Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are taking calls this segment, 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320. You can listen to us on the radio, by the way. We're on in Washington, D.C., 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also on in Kansas City, 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM. We're also online. We're on Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music. We're on Spotify. We're also on YouTube. Just do a search for either Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas. Or go over to Twitter, twitter.com/FaultLinesRadio. And you'll see right up top we have a Periscope feed up there. Again, though, we're taking calls, 202-521-1320. Let's go straight to calls, and then we can come back to your monologue. But I just want to get into this. We have a few callers early in. Again, we are taking calls, 202-521-1320. Jim from Alexandria. Jim, you're on. What's going on?
Well, I want to talk a little bit about identity politics, okay? My mother was born in Cork, Ireland, and my father was born in America from Donegal. And my mother is what's called Black Irish because she tans up like toast. My dad burns like raspberries. I mean, really bad. And, you know, I have a little bit of both, but more of my dad. And so I brought this up because we're talking about the vice president's nominee who is part Jamaican, I guess.
Yeah, she's Jamaican and Indian or something.
No, part Indian. I don't know where from. We don't have enough of that information yet. You know, I don't know how white the Jamaican was because Jamaica was a mixed breed and India was a mixed breed, and so she comes out really nice. She's a very pretty woman. She's kind of, I don't know, yellow, I guess, yellowish, light-colored skin. And she's claiming.
Jim, let's get to the main thing. Let's not, give an analysis of her skin tone. What's the specifics that you're going with for the call?
Well, she's mixed breed. I mean, Obama was mixed breed. I mean, he had a white mother and a Kenyan father. I mean, it's kind of crazy. And
I know, but what is that indicative? Oh, I see what you mean. You're saying that because she's mixed, that's not necessarily the same thing as her being black. When people are trying to say he made a black choice for vice president.
Well, I think a lot of people put up the fact that she went to Howard University, so that must mean that she must be more black than Indian or whatever,
No, I don't think it's that. Keep in mind, in America, the rule was if you had one drop of black in you, you were considered black. And so, I mean, you can make a case that she's not a descendant of slaves, fair enough, but I don't know the value of it. I mean, Joe Biden didn't choose her because well, let me just say thank you for the call, and we'll go to the next caller with Tarif in a moment. But Joe Biden didn't choose her for a lot of this other stuff. Joe Biden chose her because, from the standpoint of the public, she's considered black. That's the beginning and end. She also had policies that was within the neoliberal wing of the party. She was a moderate. She was willing to shape her positions based on whatever came up in the moment. She was heavy on criminal justice. I mean, laughing while you're locking up stoners or keeping somebody in prison on death row. Those things are horrendous. Even the truancy violation, where she was laughing about terrorizing a mom who was homeless, who had 2 kids who she couldn't keep in school. As if the issue was that, she couldn't keep them in school. The issue was that the mom was homeless. I am saying that Kamala Harris has a lot of problems and faults, but the thing is, what Joe Biden was looking for was very specific. I want somebody who's similar to me. I want somebody who I could pass it on to, who will be within this kind of neoliberal clique. And I want somebody who I can act as if I'm giving something away despite not giving anything away. She's a perfect choice for that. I mean, you could say that maybe Warren for lefties, but 70% of people who are voting for Biden are doing so because they are not Trump. And so this argument of you have nowhere else to go in Biden's head, that still may carry weight. And until lefties get to the point of saying, no, you're going to lose, you're going to fail, we're going to ensure that you fail if you keep this up, then nothing really changes because Biden doesn't have to give anything away. And that's what it boils down to. They don't have to give anything away. Tarif, well, first, Shane, any comments on that?
I mean, no quick comments. We've talked this stuff over enough already. At least right now, let's just go straight to Tarif.
Okay. Tarif, what's going on?
Good morning, gentlemen. I have two comments. My first comment is dealing with registered voting. Make sure y'all register to vote and also check to see if you're still registered, just to make sure everything's all right. I'm calling my the Louisiana election board today to make sure everything's all right and ask them some questions, which I'm going to say tomorrow on y'all show, about the whole process. My second comment is this. The camera footage released from the police officers some weeks ago dealing with George Floyd, right? I thought about something. You got Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, right, running for president and vice VP. What if that police officer that knelt on George Floyd's neck walk away, right? He get off. He's not convicted of manslaughter or second or third degree murder, whatever. What's going to happen is this. You're going to have a new round of protests, and it's going to happen before November the 3rd, I think. New round of protests, and you're going to have Joe Biden, Al Sharpton, Kamala Harris, Barack Obama, Michelle Obama. It's going to be almost like a Democratic DNC event, and they're going to be marching with people in the street. And people are going to see this as if Joe Biden cares. Right? This is my opinion now. And they're going to forget about the 94 crime bill, the things he said in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and he sponsored Patriot Act. He didn't say anything with the FISA Act or anything like that. And they're going to back this man. They're going to take all their energy before the November the 3rd election. They could put it right back into the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party won't do anything about poverty or come up with solutions dealing with people needing work and Medicaid single payer or public option, anything like that.
Yeah.
So I think something's going to happen before the election dealing with George Floyd. His debt going to be used politically. God forbid, that poor man's debt going to be used politically again. And I feel to believe you're going to see people in the street again, and it's going to be a connection of BLM with the DNC. They're going to be marching in the street, and the media is going to be back, and everybody's going to be back. And so I expect that police officer to get off because it's more political capable, in my opinion, for him to get off than for him to be sentenced. That's my take. I think he should be sentenced to jail. And yes, I do support law enforcement. They have good cops, but he just wasn't a good person. I just wish he had love in his heart to realize what he done was wrong or something. But I'm just saying this. Something's going to happen before the election. And I think it's a plan. I don't know. Something's going to happen in the election.
Thank you for the call, Tarif. Thanks for the call, man.
Thanks, Tarif.
I don't know if that stuff is planned, but I wouldn't be shocked if something happens before the election. Whether it's him getting off, whether it's the housing crisis, whatever. What I do suspect, and I think we've talked about it before, Shane, that I actually think is probably more true than not, that if any other shooting, 1,000 shootings takes place a year, any new occurrence, whether this person gets off, whether what's his name gets off, or whether somebody else gets off, whether they don't charge Breonna Taylor, whatever that is, and there's that spark, the Democratic Party is going to be standing there, arm in arm, up until the election is over with. Now, understand what I mean by this. The Democratic Party is okay with Black Lives Matter as long as Black Lives Matter is giving them energy. Meaning, as long as it looks like these guys are working in tandem with one another, there's no issue here. Everybody's on the same page. Yeah, Obama's going to be out there marching. Joe Biden is going to be out there marching along. All of them. And none of them are going to be willing to do anything of real substance. If you're telling me, honestly, that Black Lives Matter, then it needs to matter beyond just the criminal context. It needs to also matter in the lives that are being lost because of the jobs, in the lives that are being lost because of COVID-19, in the mental issues that people have to deal with, and the poverty that is part and parcel to the reason that you're out there protesting in the first place, despite the fact that all of it's being put on cops. It's like we're asking cops to do things that they have no power to do. And when, as human beings, they break down and throw, have defects and end up being overly violent, and they end up with a culture of just violence, goons, whatnot, going through policing and whatnot, we need to accept for the moment that part and parcel to what allows that process to take place is the poverty that basically gives the government just reason to put cops in there in the first place. I don't want human beings in those bad positions, whether it's the cop being put in that position or whether it's the person where that cop is being drawn towards. I don't want it. And the only way to deal with that is to deal with the original sin of that, which is poverty. Now, somebody can make an argument to me that poverty is not going to get rid of all the crime. That's true. Poverty is not going to get rid of all the cop abuse. That's true. But if you're looking for a statistical way to try to move yourself out of one context into another, that's where you start. And that is not something, by the way, that the Democratic Party is going to do. What they did was exactly what I said they were going to do. They were going to blame it all on cops. They're going to say we're going to get some kind of police stuff in, and they were going to ignore the inciting cause, which is poverty. We have one more caller, DJ from Florida. DJ, what's going on?
Hey, how's it going? The Kamala Harris's remark you made earlier about that racist one-drop rule, that is
that is a racist rule.
I heard that. The whole
But it is the idea of America, though, right? That wasn't me making that up.
No, I know you weren't making that up. That's a white person who actually made that up. He said if that person has one drop of black blood, they're not white, they're black regardless. And they were cast to the underclass of society. And I just thought that was interesting that you mentioned that. But Kamala Harris in general, that's a smack in the face to the democratic process, to a system of meritocracy, to black people. Kamala Harris, at one point in time, I'm pretty sure she was identifying as an Indian, or a Native American, excuse me. And when I said Indian, I meant like Indian in Asia. And no one knows. She's completely racially ambiguous, and she says and does whatever she wants. But the whole reason for her being picked was her gender, her race. That's a huge smack in the face. I initially was like, I'm not going to vote for anyone because I don't think that Trump is great, But I do not feel like Trump has done more harm to me as a person, as a black man in the United States of America, than Joe Biden. Joe Biden has been responsible for a lot of policies that have put me in a compromising position, people like me. And if I'm being totally honest, and no one's going to really like that I'm saying this, but while Donald Trump was in office, this was the first time I made close to $100,000 a year at a job. I made $87,000 base pay the second year Donald Trump was in office. I'm not giving him the credit for that, but I just don't see him being as harmful. If you put a gun to my head and said, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, I'm going with Donald Trump. I donated almost every paycheck I had to Bernie Sanders' campaign. He smacked all of us in the face, and now we're here where they're picking people based off of their skin color and their gender. It's a smack in the face. It is disgusting. I'm ashamed of just everything that's happened. It's a clown show.
Thank you for the call, DJ. Yeah, I think a lot of people are with you there. Anyway, we're going to go into a break. Appreciate the call. We'll be back in a minute with Mark Frost. We're talking about the economy and more. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics? Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Frost. We're joined by Mark Frost this segment and the next. Mark Frost is an economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, also libertarian-ish. Mark, thank you for joining us this morning. I have a very quick question. We actually haven't gotten exactly into this with you. What does the ish part there mean? How do you deviate from the standard libertarian dogma?
Well, I've actually changed my profile because I'm mad at the libertarians, but in a nutshell, there's more than two, but there's two main core groups within libertarianism, and they have a lot of friction with each other. There are the anarcho-capitalists who actually like debt. They want to see the structure of society fall, because then they can get their anarchistic utopia set up. Their argument is, if Oklahoma wants to be racist and not allow black people, and there's not even in Oklahoma, let's just say somebody's property doesn't like black people, they cannot allow black people. If some people don't like white people, they can have their own thing, and people can trade with each other, blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of an extreme wing of the libertarians. I'm a libertarian in the sense that I don't think government is evil. I think it's a good thing. I don't think taxation is theft. I think that it's a legal appropriation for funds of government. So that's kind of the difference. So when I say libertarianish to some, if you just say libertarian to some people, that implies that you are an anarcho-capitalist.
It does. Yeah,
Mark,
I know
I'm glad
very
you
well.
answered that, because that's a great explanation. I make that assumption myself. When I talk to libertarians, oftentimes they are part of the first brand that Mark mentioned. This, like you say, if Oklahoma, I've heard libertarians even argue, you don't even need democracy, you just need capitalism. Whereas like this notion that the public gets a choice and that type of stuff. Yeah. Go ahead, Shane. I'm sorry. I just wanted to interject. I'm glad you explained that, Mark.
Yeah, I know. I think that's.
And I argue rather emphatically that capitalism is not an economic system. It's a political system based on the premise of property rights, that individuals have the right to own property. And most libertarians have a common denominator in that the ultimate property that we own is ourself. So I take that premise in answering almost every social question. Should drugs be legal? Do I have the right to self-medicate? Well, yes, I argue I do. Why? Because I own my own self. My fundamental property is my body. If I want to put marijuana in it, that's my choice. Now, if marijuana ends up harming me, that's my responsibility to accept as well, because it works both ways. But it is interesting to look at both the anarcho-communists and the anarcho-capitalists. If you just look at their ideology and you abstract communism and capitalism out, they both want to see the structure of modern society, which they see as blatantly evil, crumble. So it's not uncommon to see an anarcho-capitalist, for instance, loving massive debt, because they understand that eventually is going to bring down the house of cards, as they would call it. So what makes the non-anarcho-capitalist libertarians sort of interesting is we're kind of in the middle. I'm right with the Democrats on things like legalization of drugs, the right to an abortion, the right to own yourself in a private manner, what you do in your own home, the right to be gay, the right to be trans, that kind of a thing. So I'm very Democrat, if you will, and just not use Democrat, Republican. I'm very liberal in the modern sense of the world in that. On the other side of the coin, I believe that I earn my money,
And I'm not real big on giant marginal tax rates like 80% and some of those types of things. So in terms of the culture, most libertarians that are not of the anarcho-capitalist flavor are sort of in the middle. And it's kind of an odd thing to watch in modern times.
Mark, thank you. Yeah, I would actually, I have a few questions I could get into with that, but I think it'd be best to save that for another time. We're talking first up about the jobs numbers, the general state of the economy. The jobs numbers are obviously a window into the state of that economy. But it's weird. Jobs appear to have been going up. Are these just recovering from the losses we'd seen in months preceding that? Is that how you take these? And if so, do you think that we should be taking these with a note of optimism, or is this just a temporary or a partial recovery, and you think we're still in for more? Mark?
I think it's the nature of just numbers right now. I don't think that right now you can look at job numbers and say it's a positive thing or a negative thing. Because if you just look at it as a thought experiment, if you have 30 million people that you throw out of work because of an exogenous event, you can blame it on the virus or you can blame it on the shutdown. But at the end of the day, we had an exogenous event and a bunch of people became unemployed. Well, it's natural that after that exogenous point, that more people would start working. So when you look at the job numbers, most people are reporting them as percentages, you know. But so of course, once the pendulum of shutdown starts to be released, you're going to have massive amounts of jobs that come back in the beginning. So I don't want to say I'm pessimistic, because there's macroeconomic variables that look very positive for the country. So from a pure economist perspective, we're not in that bad a shape right now. The problem that we have going forward is a complex political one. How do we open the economy? And I've been very consistent on this since I think it was the second day of the pandemic, when everybody realized, oh, this isn't just a flu, this is something more serious. And after 9/11, we rightly gave lawsuit immunity to the airlines. The government basically paid off the victims of 9/11 themselves, and they prohibited them from going to court and suing. There isn't going to be any kind of recovery until something like that is done. If we, every client, as you guys know, I run a payments company. I have 800 plus clients all around the country. Every single one of them that shut down has confessed to me, every single one of them, they have confessed to me in private. The primary reason, not that they're not concerned about their customers or their employees, because they are, but the number one reason was fear of lawsuits. And so my view is Congress really needs to get together and hash this out and think it out. Republicans need to understand that there are people who probably will have been damaged in a negligent sense by some businesses that were reckless, and they need to appropriate funds for that particular purpose. Democrats need to recognize that you can't have a Yugoslavia of lawsuits and expect the economy to come back in a functioning manner. So first and foremost, in my view, any reopening of the economy without that is just going to have people gun shy. Because what drives me crazy right now is in part the Republicans, because they're such supply-siders. There's never been more capital, or let me say it differently. There's never been more excess capital in the U.S. economy than right now. There is no lack of funds. There's no lack of capital. There's lack of entrepreneurial opportunities for that capital to go right now. And so what we need to do is to put money into the hands of people who will actually spend it. And then I want to emphasize, not save it, not save it. And we have a name for the, excuse me. and we have a name for those people. They're called poor people and the working poor. If you give money to a poor person or a person who's the working poor, they will spend the money. They won't save it and invest it. So,
Mark, are you saying that? Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I want to hear. Oh, I'm shocked by this. That's why I'm shocked by this. But go for it. Go ahead. I want to hear it. I'm sorry.
What we're doing is just nickel and diming it. Just look at the last appropriation. Very little of it actually went to the actual people. It went to this group, this business, and they didn't even need it. Because again, if you're a company like mine, I have access to all the capital in the world. If I want to expand tomorrow, I call the bank up and I go, hey, throw $1 million in my account. And they do it. It's that easy. It's literally, I pick up the phone and I have the money to go do what I want.
Mark, you are the second libertarian. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry?
No, I was going to say, you're the second libertarian that I've heard make this argument. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because what we have is those old style pumps. I'm sure you've heard the expression prime the pump. We need demand. We don't need more supply. We need demand. So if it was me, I was just toying with numbers, and I don't know that these are the right numbers, but I think if it was me, if I was king, I would do something. I would come up with an algorithm that says people under X amount of verifiable income would get $10,000 check right off the bat. It would be reduced by some algorithm as your income increased to where it wouldn't exist at all after a certain point. And then I love the PUA program, not for helping people out with, not for protecting the unemployed so much. I love the PUA program because it puts money into people's hands that will spend it. And my problem with Republicans right now, such as Rand Paul, for instance, they're so worried that some of that PUA money is going to be unfair. That it's going to be more than what people are making. It doesn't matter. The worst thing we should be thinking about right now is fairness. We want to literally rain money from helicopters, so to speak, directly down on people who will spend it. If you give me $1,200, it's going in the bank. I don't need $1,200. It does nothing. It doesn't change my spending behavior in the slightest sense. It's like giving normal people a quarter. I mean, it doesn't really change their spending habits. And for this to work, for real stimulus to happen, the Democrats and Republicans need to stop playing politics for a while and quit trying to use working people. And they both do it. I don't care what anybody says. Both sides are doing it. And the people that are going to be suffering are the people that tend to suffer in these things the most. It's the people that have less skills, they have less options in the marketplace, and those are the people that if you give money to them, they will spend it. And the argument is, well, some people will take that PUA money and go buy crack with it. Well, who cares? Crackhead Bob gets $10,000. And he spends $4,000 with his crack dealer. His crack dealer is going to take that money and spend it somewhere else too. And then the person he spends it with is going to spend it. And it trickles up rather than trickles down. And
Mark, let's come back to you for a moment. We need to take a break. Well, let's come back. I'm going to let you finish your thought. But man, I am shocked by this. I agree with you 1,000%, Mark. Mark Frost, that's who you've been listening to. Economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, and Libertarian-ish. We'll be back in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. We've been speaking with Mark Frost, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, and Libertarian-ish. Mark, I have to be honest. I've agreed, I think, with nearly everything you've said this morning. And you know, for me, for libertarians, it's always half and half. It's like I agree with the, leave people alone for their drug use, leave people alone for the things that they want to do, and I tend to disagree with some of the other stuff. But on this very specific point, I agree with you 1,000%. I don't care if crackhead Bob gets $10,000 and spends $4,000 of it on crack. Like you say, his dealer is going to take his girlfriend out to lunch. His dealer is going to put that money somewhere else.
Exactly.
Crackhead Bob even is going to spend that money somewhere else. It's not like the money vanishes and disappears. From your standpoint, you said there were macroeconomic variables in this country that we should, that indicate strength, meaning that this will be okay going forward later on, provided we could get through this kind of sticky time. How do you make this argument to, honestly, what I would consider in large part ideologues, that no, let the economy do what the economy does. We shouldn't intercede. The government shouldn't give any additional money for it, any of this stuff. And how do you really get across to them that the money that they invest right now from the standpoint of stimulus is to their benefit, because it will end up back in their pockets in this kind of roundabout way that money moves through the economy?
I think that, I guess my response to them would be, it's one thing to be an ideologue in the classroom. There's a lot of economists that's never run a real business, and they have theories about things that are not realistic. If we were living in a purely capitalist economy where prices are allowed to adjust instantly, there's a strong argument for what they're talking about, because in the long run, it all works out. Wages go down, more people are hired because workers are cheaper, blah, blah, blah. But in the real mixed economy that we have what we economists call structural rigidities, where the price isn't allowed to clear that easily. We have minimum wage laws. We have capital controls. We have all sorts of things. So we've decided as a society we don't want a pure laissez-faire capitalist government. We don't want that. I doubt 5% of the public wants that. So given the reality that we have, what's the best way to proceed? Well, what you can't have, what my gripe with the anarcho-capitalists is they market. Well, what really happens in real life is people preach laissez-faire when the market's doing great. But as soon as you have a major crash or there's a major exogenous shock, everybody becomes a socialist all of a sudden. And now it's like, oh, well, we want the Fed to print money. We want the government to pay this. We want the government to take all the pain away. And my favorite economist argued that recessions were he actually used the German word because he was German. Recessions are the cold douche of capitalism, in that they work out the weak and that sort of a thing. But we don't have capitalism. We have a mixed economy. Oh, excuse me. We have capitalism, but we have redistributive capitalism, and we have social justice laws that have been passed to soften the blow to the people who don't compete well in a capitalist society. I mean, my goodness, we have 11 million people in this country with IQs under 85. 11 million. Those people are still humans. They have to go do something, but they're not going to do the kind of work I do, to be blunt. They're just not. And as a compassionate society, we've made some choices. And what economists, or at least what I insist on, is our values cost us something. And what the people on the far right on the capitalist side, that is the anarcho-capitalists, do, is they act like the country that we have is this theoretical, laissez-faire, completely unregulated economy. And because they want that, that's the way that they engage and they lobby for policy. Again, there's a lot, in my view, there's some similarity between them and the anarcho-communists that are burning buildings and doing all that kind of stuff right now. I would not be shocked if secretly the anarcho-capitalists are just rubbing their hands in glee right now saying, yeah, the government's about to fall, the government's about to fall, because that's what they predict. They're looking for it to fall. And I think, you know, so again, that's sort of why I've distanced myself from them in social media with the libertarian-ish.
Let's dig into the IQ thing for a moment.
Seems like
oh, good. Sorry. Sure.
Well, just one quick thing. I can pass it over to you, Jamarl. But I mean, the anarcho-communists and the anarcho-capitalists, broad division there. But one brief interpretation here is they're both accelerationists. They're both trying to sort of accelerate certain rates of growth. So the anarcho-communists would probably want capitalism to sort of reach its peak and then be done. Arguably, it's already long since past its peak, according to them. But they would want to sort of destroy capitalism by, you know, bringing it to some sort of self-destructive fruition, like Marx foresaw. Whereas the anarcho-capitalists are sort of accelerationists with capitalism, believing that it'll destroy government, believing that capitalism will basically win. As far as I can tell, that seems to be the main thing. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but otherwise, Jamarl, I didn't want to interrupt there.
Well, I just want to get into the IQ thing.
They're a problem. Sure.
No, Mark, answer that, because that's a really good point that Shane made.
Yes, I mean, I view them, in a way of speaking, I view them as 0 degrees and 360 degrees. Different numbers, but similar positions on the compass.
This is a very random. This is a very random note, and more like a palate cleanser or something like that. This is extremely out of nowhere esoteric. But in physics, there's this object, the twister. The spinner that a bunch of folks are probably familiar with, where basically, anyway, it has to do with the angular momentum of certain kinds of particle. But the idea is if you do a full rotation, you reverse the sign, and then you have to do another full rotation for it to come back to normal. So this is, it explains some of the stuff of positives and negatives. Anyway, conservation of angular momentum, but with quantum physics. It's kind of like you're saying, if you do this full reversal from anarchism to anarcho-communism, you get a change of the sign. It goes in the opposite direction. Either it's, you know, communist or capitalist, but it's fundamentally acting in very much the same way. It's in the same place. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, it's in regards towards the state. I mean, you know, it's like the state is a pain.
Right. You know, as an example, anarcho-capitalists don't believe in publicly funded police forces. Everybody would, the market would produce police services, and you would subscribe to a police force. Well, the question is begged, what happens if I am at the Acme police force and you're at the Widget police force, and we have a disagreement? Do our police forces fight? So my view, when I take off the economist hat and put on the political economist hat, I think both extremes, the central tendency for their evolution is fascism. I don't mean it in the sense that the word is thrown around today. I mean fascism as the third way. It's not really communism. It's not really capitalism. But the reason governments formed in the first place was because one government decides they want to come, or one tribe decides they want to take over some other tribe. So the tribes band together because they're stronger in larger numbers. And so I think both of the extremes are destructive to society, and they would probably agree, because what they really want is this mixed economy that they consider incredibly evil, a violation of the sovereign rights of the individual. They will not mind seeing society degrade to the point where that it doesn't make sense to itself. And I think we're seeing what my favorite economists prophesied. The greatest book, in my view, ever written in economics is Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, 1943, written by Joseph Schumpeter. And in it, he says Marx was right that capitalism must fail. He was wrong as to why. It isn't going to fail because of its inability to provision the proletariat. It's going to fail because it provisions them so well. And you end up with a society of intellectuals who are so critical that the system itself no longer makes sense. And he argued that capitalism wasn't an economic system, that it's a social system, and it has to make sense to the participants. It's one of the reasons why people like me, who can be very critical of FDR, also believe that FDR saved capitalism, because you can still have capitalism and have 50% tax rates and still have medical care. You can still have, even if they don't deserve it in the anarcho-capitalist sense, you can still give people with IQs of 85 a dignified and honorable life. You can fight poverty. You can do things that only capitalism allows you to do, because only capitalism, from the study of economic systems since recorded history, produces enough capital to do these sorts of things. Norway is not a socialist country. They're a capitalist country, but they pay for the services that they value. One of the things we don't do in this country is we spend money and then lower tax rates. I mean, it's the craziest thing in the world. I think that we ought to raise tax rates, because I'm not going to, if they raised my taxes by, say, 15%, I'm still going to conduct my business the same way I always have. It's not going to change anything I'm doing right now. But what it will do is it doesn't steal so much from my great-grandchildren that and the next generation. So I think Republicans could learn from Democrats, and I think Democrats can learn from Republicans. And my gripe as an economist is I hear these people, it's almost like little children that want that want to win the argument so bad, they're willing to do almost anything to do it, and it's distressing. I think all this talk about lowering tax rates at a time when we're spending extra trillions is just ridiculous, and it plays right into the hands of both the anarcho-communists and the anarcho-capitalists. I'm going to get a lot of hate mail after this one, I promise you. I have a lot
Honestly,
of
Mark, you're going to get a lot of love mail from me, because I am shocked by what I'm hearing here. And maybe I'm shocked by it because I pegged you as the former, the anarcho-libertarian. Where is usually when you have those arguments, it's like, yeah, we don't need the military, we don't need this, we don't need that. We could just pay out of our pockets for the fire department. And it's like, well, what about contracts? And it's like, this company has to get his own military to fight the other company because they don't like the contract. Like, that stuff it doesn't make sense when you walk through it. When, from the perspective that you're giving, though, I may disagree with some of the tenets that you may give for this, but I can't say I disagree with what you've said here today. So if you get the hate mail, send some of it my way, I'll back you up if that helps any on the show. But Mark, we've been talking to Mark Frost, rational, libertarianish, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, and Eagle Scout and Marine. Mark, thank you again for coming on the show. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the politically independent corner, stretched from wall to wall, pro-crusty style, it's a weird reference, I am your investigative radio show host, Shane Stranahan.
You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to some headlines, but before we get to headlines, I honestly have to give a shout out to Mark Frost. Oftentimes I get into this quandary where I think to myself, would people, if things got really, really bad, would they be rational? And rational towards the standpoint of human health, happiness, etc., etc. And oftentimes my answer is no, they won't be that way. The world will come to an end. And Mark, that's not the way I felt with him. I had this feeling like, no, you have to take rational action regardless of what I believe. Ideologically, there is rational action that you must take, and even within the context of that belief system, it is to some degree rational. Shout out to Mark Frost, man. We have to have him back on to dig more into him on that.
Yeah, just before you get into headlines, I'd love to talk with him. He also was bringing up, obviously, we have him on pretty frequently, but I'd love to talk with him more about that. Also, I'd love to talk with him more about Joseph Schumpeter, the economist he mentioned, his favorite economist, one of my favorite economists. We could talk, he mentioned his book, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy. I haven't finished it, but I've read bits of it. And it's just some of the stuff there. Schumpeter's work on like creative destruction, the idea of sort of outmoding old modes and orders by creating new things. I think that's totally applicable during the current crisis, politically, economically. Yeah. If you look at the economy with COVID, you're going to be a bunch of technological adjustments, but just in general, there are big opportunities there. So I'd love to talk with him about that. But Jamarl,
unfortunately, those things tend to go to like the 1% though. But yeah, I'm gonna check this book out. And one more thing, him making the argument that capitalism is not purely an economic system. I agree. I used to think that those things were interrelated, that you couldn't necessarily talk about one without the other. It's like, yeah, we have a democratic system. Yeah, how are you getting resources? And what system are you using for it? So I'm even glad that he brought that up. I love, there's so much I love about that interview. But let's get to the headlines. Let's do the headlines. Presidential candidate and former Vice President Biden and current Vice Presidential candidate Kamala Harris appeared together in Delaware as running mates for the first time, with Harris attacking President Trump over his response to the coronavirus, saying that the reason the coronavirus has hit the United States harder than any other country is, quote, unquote, because of Trump's failure to take it seriously from the start. The Biden campaign said it raised $26 million in one day following his announcement that Harris would be the VP pick, and 538 is saying that Biden has a 72% chance to win the election. I would like to point out that 72% chance is pretty much the same that Hillary Clinton had to win the election. Nate Silver. President Trump, meanwhile, has said he's looking forward to the debate between Vice President Pence and Senator Harris, saying that it should be better than Pence debating with Tim Kaine. Don't know why you believe that. The decision to switch a new reporting system for COVID cases is proving disruptive, as many are reporting serious delays in public release of hospital data nearly a month after the federal government ordered states to report directly to the Department of Health and Human Services, bypassing the CDC. Important data like the number of beds occupied by the coronavirus hospital patients is now lagging by a week or more. Totally by accident, I suppose. The head of the CDC, Robert Redfield, had issued a dire request asking people to follow 4 steps or risk the worst fall from a public health perspective we've ever had, quote unquote. Those 4 steps are to wear a mask, social distance, wash your hands, and to be smart about crowds. The head of the EPA is today set to reverse an Obama-era regulation on greenhouse gas emissions, specifically on the release of methane. The new rule eliminates requirements that oil and gas companies must install technology to detect and fix methane leaks from wells, pipelines, and storage sites, which new EPA officials say is needed to free the oil and gas industry from crippling regulations. Whether people realize it or not, methane is especially strong at maintaining carbon. And part of the concerns that people were having was that methane was going to be leaked from the Arctic as the ice got away, and which was going to create more conditions for greenhouse gases. Just because you don't see it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not there. I can't necessarily see my breath, but I am breathing. And just in the same way, carbon can fill up in your atmosphere, increasing the temperature on your planet. Just because you are not aware from it in a direct feeling way doesn't necessarily mean that those things are not happening. That is a disastrous ruling. Damage assessments are continuing in the Midwest with the aftermath of this week's windstorms. Many farmers lost their crops, with Iowa and Illinois hit the hardest, while Illinois Farm Bureau says it's too early to estimate crop losses. Many fields are reportedly completely flattened, with damages to structures also widespread. There have also been reports of widespread infrastructure damage in the states. And then last but not least, Sheriff Billy Woods of Marion County Sheriff's Office is telling staff to not wear masks when on duty, except in a few key circumstances. At the courthouse, schools, hospitals, and while on patrol and responding to nursing home or involving a high-risk elderly individual. In an email sent to the department on August 11th, Sheriff Woods wrote, "The fact is the amount of professionals that give the reason why we should, I can find the exact same amount of professionals that say we shouldn't." This came as Marion County reported 13 deaths on Tuesday alone, its own single-day record. That angers me so much. You are all caught up. That's the news. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. You know, if you make an argument to me that you should wear a mask when you're interacting with an elderly person or somebody who's ill. For example, if a cop pulls me over and I'm in Marion County, I may not look ill. I may not have anything that's on me that makes me look like I'm infirmed in any particular kind of way. And yet, he could interact with me in a way where he passes something on to me because maybe I do have an illness that he's just entirely unaware of. It may be high blood pressure. It may be high cholesterol. I may be overweight. I may have kidney failure. I may have some other major disease that he can't identify, he can't tell. The idea that you're going to say, hey, only wear a mask in these specific situations, as opposed to just the basic, seems like good policy, even if you don't necessarily can't take it as a flat fact that this is doing X or this is doing Y, would be just on precaution. It's a piece of cloth around your face in comparison to somebody getting potentially sick and dying as a result of your actions. So the notion that he's going to take this policy is obscene. It's utterly obscene. Let's see, we have callers. Adam in Colorado. Adam, what's going on?
Hey, morning, guys. Wanted to mention the last guest did excellent. I disagree on the liability point, but on where he is correct, there's the aggregate demand equation, which says you have consumer spending, private investment, government spending, and net exports all factoring into the total demand equation. What he was talking about giving money to the poor is to stimulate the consumer demand. He also was correct on the police point. We tried that with fire departments, and many cities burned down. So we have to have some common goods. But on
Mark
liability,
was on point.
Yeah.
I mean, he was on point on a lot of that stuff, Adam.
Rivers.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if you're dumping into rivers, if you are, I use the equivalence of if you're taking a poo in the punch bowl. You have to have consequences for pooing in the punch bowl. And so here, you need liability because it's causing direct harm. The whole deregulating so that people no longer are held liable for their actions that harm others. Sure, it can have a stimulating effect on the economy because you no longer have a risk factor in what you're doing. You no longer have to care about the ramifications to society by deregulation or removing liability for your actions.
Yeah, the idea there is that you're trying to make people accountable basically for the negative externalities they're potentially creating. That's the whole thing. And then some people will bring up the slippery slope argument. I don't think it exactly applies because I think broadly culture and the state laws are pretty effective, I think, at reining in excessive violations of sort of what's right in an intuitive sense. But some people will make the case that if you start to make people liable for some negative externalities, you're opening the door to making them liable for a lot more that people shouldn't be held accountable for. I mean, this can be taken to an absurd degree. If you look at sort of dystopian takes on society where people are going to be held liable for their opinions or things like that. Anyway, those are truly outlandish. I think
it's always subjective.
I think broadly it applies.
Yeah. It's always subjective, right? There's always some kind of intermediary ground between those things. Like, for example, should an oil and gas company be responsible for the carbon they put into the atmosphere, especially if we as the public is going to get stuck with paying for it while they get to just enjoy the billions? Yeah,
totally.
I think they should be held.
Let's talk methane for just a second. We've got Mary on the line, and we are taking
methane is a really good point.
202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. 1320. Okay, so methane, really simple molecule. It's just 1 carbon, 4 hydrogens, all in a ring around that carbon. Here's the one thing. When I think of methane, the problem that people constantly bring up, in fact, the primary sort of reason I hear people bringing methane up is the release from cattle, where you're raising cattle, you're raising various animals. That's actually a minority of methane release in the country. I think that, like, last I checked, it was something like 4% or less than 10%, definitely. But that is significant. And that's literally the only part of this that I take issue with, which is when people bring up methane, specifically, they're often bringing it up against the raising of cattle. But if you're raising cattle if you're raising grass-fed cattle, and you're doing it well, then ideally you're building up soil, and that soil will come to contain methanophiles because they'll want to be there because there'll be methane in the local environment. And then they'll break down those bacteria, basically will break down the methane, and you'll have increased populations of those. And then you can sort of monitor it. The problem is, and this is,
but you can also change the diet of the cows.
Exactly.
I mean, if you change the diet of the cows, the methane thing goes away.
Exactly. If you raise them on grass, then they're producing less methane, and then it's getting restored. The real problem is just cattle being fed in feedlots with tons of grain. I just felt the need.
What's the cheapest way to do it? Right. It's cheapness, right? I mean, this goes back to the capitalism thing. Like that's what I say. Those are things that I disagree with Marco on. When he's like, well, you can cut wages. Yeah, but if you cut wages, you're talking about a person not being able to buy the product that the person is producing. You get into these kind of weird contradictions. But those things, you can maneuver out of those. Like for example, Richard Wolff. When Richard Wolff argues from the standpoint of socialism or Marxism, what he basically argues is, look, let workers be in charge of the companies that those workers are working at and give them more agency in the job. Now, I immediately said, isn't that still capitalism? Because don't you still have these little companies fighting other companies? But his thing is, you take one move at a time. Now, I think some people look at that and say, well, that's no longer capitalism. I would say that pretty much.
That's also worker ownership. So there's this question of whether in an economy, whether in a non-capitalist economy, you need to have an entirely state-controlled or entirely generally controlled property, specifically the means of production, as opposed to something like syndicalism or whatever, where you have either unionized businesses or worker-owned cooperatives or whatever the case may be, where you have an economy constructed out of that. Yeah. And I mean, it seems like we're living in a society that has plenty of that. I mean, if you look this isn't people usually don't take these as businesses, but a wide variety of, a wide variety of businesses, large and small, actually do seem to work that way. I mean, you could probably see more of that, though. Especially
with many of the tech companies and the way these guys start up and whatnot. And so, it's like, is that still capitalism? And it's like, you get into these kind of weird subjective points of people explaining it one way or the other. Like, I would call out current system capitalism. Other people would say, no, this is some other kind of capitalism. It's like, okay, whatever. All of it is, reeks of the same thing. I guess my thing is, I don't like these arguments over capitalism, socialism, or anything else. What I like the argument is basically, what do you need to do to deal with the situation that's presented? And if that issue is, we need to make sure people have health care, then figure out how to do it. I don't care what you call it. Now, if it's how do you save the world, meaning from like a environmental crisis from something that's taken over the entire planet, if that means that you need to have restrictions on what you consider to be this kind of capitalism, then do so. It's more important to save the planet. Now, the catch becomes, what's your priority? And in many respects, in the same way that Mark explained it, I've met plenty of people who will take this conceptual priority of events where they're willing to accept all sorts of havoc and chaos as long as they can make their profits, or as long as, they're okay. And it's like, it doesn't work that way. They're not or things that are... Oh, go ahead.
Or as long as they see their ideology coming to fruition. It's not just the pursuit of personal profit. It's also just the pursuit of this general profit or something like that. If you've idealized something and internalized it, then you'll pursue that. Anyway, we should go to a break. We are still taking calls, by the way, 202-521-1320. Mary from Maryland will be with you in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be right back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here.
Real
Opinions for real people.
So where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
We actually let them expand on their views.
what's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're taking calls 202-521-1320. You can call again, 202-521-1320. We have Mary calling in from Maryland. Mary, you're on the line. What's going on?
Good morning, gentlemen. I had called earlier to ask to see what happened to the two previous hosts of this show, which I loved, and then I found out what happened. Then I said, okay, it was brewing. Then I found out that I love you more.
Oh, thank you, Murray.
Thank you. That's really sweet.
You're welcome, and that's a fact. And
I appreciate that, Murray. Usually it's the opposite call. Usually it's swap to the other two hosts. You guys suck. Bring the other two back. And we understand that because ultimately, you know, they were here for like 3 years. So, but no, I appreciate the call. Thank you, Murray. Thank you. But what were you going to say? I apologize for interrupting.
Mulberry bush to get to a point. Anyway, I was listening and I was hearing the phrase "business as usual" with the Democratic Party, and I jumped out of the bed and almost hit my head. And I got on the phone and started calling some key people, Pelosi, Clyburn, and some other people. And I said, if you make this election business as usual, I'm not going to vote, period. I'm going to protest my ass off because I'm sick and tired of this. We put people in office and then all of a sudden they creep back into business as usual. And that's what I'm seeing with Biden and Harris right now. Because didn't I hear you were racist and you're at this and you're at that?
Yeah.
And now the accolades.
She was like, I was that little black child, Joe Biden. That's Kamala Harris, right? And made that thing about the racism thing. So yeah.
Yeah, and they're in the honeymoon zone now, and I had to turn the TV off to look at tennis for the next week because I can't stand it. It's all of a sudden what happened to the visceral all of a sudden? What happened? You're a racist, and you have a bad policy, and you did this to people. What happened to that? All of a sudden now they're like in love, like they just got married or something. That just made me sick. So I'm going to be calling every one of these so-called people for the people and tell them, if you do business as usual, you can forget about my vote. You can have Trump for 4 more years.
What Joe Biden is going to tell you is go vote for the other guy. That's what Joe Biden is going to say, go vote for the other guy.
I'll not vote for any other guy. And why is AOC getting 1 minute? I brought that up like I shouted it out from the tallest mountain. I called Nancy. I said, are you kidding me? Kasich gets more time. And I said, I want the squad in front as keynote speakers, all of them. And
For a while, it looked like AOC wasn't going to get any time at all. I mean, it looked they were talking about just pulling her completely.
But see, that's what I mean. But that's what I mean when I make the point that it's honest. Like, giving AOC 60 seconds is indicative of the way they understand it.
That means that we're screwed. That's what that means to me.
Well, but what would have given you any other appraisal? Meaning, in the way they called Sanders supporters racist, sexist, bigoted, they act similar to the way that Trump voters, that meaning in the comparisons that they were giving. Elizabeth Warren gets out the racist, starts attacking Sanders, give Biden a pass. Biden lies about civil rights. They give him a pass. Nobody brings it up. Joe Biden had to drop out of the last race in the 80s for lying about being part of the civil rights movement or about plagiarizing speeches. What? Nobody brings that stuff up. And so it becomes like it's not even an election of sorts in the way that you have people who are vying and actively going after each other because they want it. It was almost, we're just going to have, a contest where we, whatever random person gets it, get it, as long as they're not Sanders.
Well, Kamala was going after Biden. She was, kind of kicking him back in 2019. We were talking about that yesterday, but I'm sure that she'll stop that now is the thing. I'm sure that her lips will be sealed from this point on, unless possibly in memoriam at some point if she gets in.
That's so sad because people keep saying
right?
Biden may not make it to the debate. All right, so let's go to the next caller. Murray, thank you. I really do appreciate that call. So let's go to Eric in New Jersey. Eric, what's going on?
Hi. I've called in quite a few times now, and I have not once, and to my, you know, I should be better. I'm a huge fan of you guys. Ever since you guys been on, I've really enjoyed the show, and I've basically spent every morning watching. Anyway, that said,
thanks so much for saying that. Just real quick, thanks, Eric.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I did want to say that markets are being confused with capitalism. Markets have always existed, whether it be the slave market back in olden times when capitalism clearly didn't exist, to you know, the idea of trade is not exclusive to capitalism, and so you can have a socialist economy where all businesses are work co-ops and still have markets. And so I just wanted to, you know, alleviate some of the confusion on that particular issue. And I agree with the last caller. Oh my God, about everything.
Yeah, she's awesome. I agree with her totally.
They're acting like fools right now, and I just cannot stand it. Anyway, that's all I have.
Thanks for the call, man. It's insufferable. I mean, they took all the time to come up with Kamala Harris as a choice. I chose Kamala Harris like months ago. And then it's like, why did you choose her? Well, she's black and she's a woman. And it's like, I don't want blacks to think we're taking them for granted by choosing somebody who blacks didn't choose during the election. I mean, it's like, come on, it's appalling. There's another one, Jordan Brown. She has no cultural ties to Jamaica and very little to Black America, grew up in a wealthy Indian household. Indian Americans should be proud, but should not be working. But she does nothing for working class blacks. That's Jordan Brown. I think that's a good point, right? Like, Joe Biden is choosing her under this idea that this is a choice to show blacks that they are not being taken for granted. And the person who they choose is somebody who identifies as Indian. It's just weird, right? I mean, it's a slap in the face on a few counts. On the count of, look, what do you want? And what is in the best interest of your group? Because this is put through the context of class. Through the context of race. Because when they're choosing her, they're not choosing her as Indian. They're choosing her as if this is a show to blacks that you're not being taken for granted. Meaning the framing of it, the entire framing of Kamala Harris being put into that has to do with an identity that she may not necessarily, under normal circumstances, assume. Like, it's like a Native American thing. If my grandfather was Cherokee. Now, if I, all of a sudden, because I wanted to get in some kind of, political thing, started really appropriating this notion of Native Americanness, whatever that means, and saying, yes, I was a part of this group, and I believe in this, and I believe in that. And somebody points out, yeah, we get that this guy has family that was Native American, but at no point of his lifetime was he really connected to this group. They're not wrong for pointing that out, and it may actually be to some degree true, even though it make people somewhat uncomfortable. I'm just making the point that as an African American, and as the callers who kind of called in, make this basic point, that to say that you're choosing somebody to show that you're not taking a community for granted, and the person that you choose does not entirely, at the very least in the beginning, identify with the group, is just another slap in the face. I have problems with this choice, not because of the person's race or anything. I have problems with the choice because what I want policy-wise will not be idolizing this person in any such way. And yes, it wasn't going to be shown in Joe Biden either way, but I think my issue is the black thing that they keep putting so much emphasis on. Whether it's Joe Biden and the civil rights movement, whether it's the choice of, I'm going to choose this particular person, and eventually becomes, okay, I just need to choose a black person because I want to go in line with Black Lives Matter. There seems to be so much focus on race and identity as opposed to, here are the policies that we want to put out that are in the best interest of America. That seems off the table. And so it's like we're stuck in this identity argument that is, it's aggravating to me. I feel it with the callers. What do you have to say, Shane?
I think we should go. We have two more calls we should get to. Stuff I could say in response, but we've only got about 4 minutes left in the segment. I just want to make sure we get to him. We've got Diego in Chino Hills.
Chino Hills? Is that right? Okay, Chino Hills. Diego, what's going on?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear us? You're on. You're on.
Okay. Just want to say I've been a big fan for years, and I'm glad for the call. And
thanks, man.
I just want to say that people got to start making demands because they chose the most pro-criminal people out of all the candidates that were running. And that Kamala Harris, since she was chosen as vice president, the prison stock went up.
Yeah.
And I remember I live in California. When Kamala Harris ran as Attorney General, she actually presented herself as Indian rather than black. So I kind of think it just, whatever suits her together more along the population and this identity politics race. And just want to keep it short. I just wondering, when our last guest, the Libertarian guy, what was the point you wanted to make on IQ that you never got to?
Oh, so the reason why I was bringing the IQ thing up is because if you have a society that says you have to compete, meaning if you can't work, you basically are not going to eat, and you have millions, let's say 11 million people with an IQ of 85, well, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's the line where the military can use a person, meaning just for basic duties of things that person, an individual, can do. That 85 number is low, and it becomes difficult for that person to function. I've had family member like this. I have an uncle. And so the question becomes, how does that person survive in America if that person can't really work in any real sense of the word, doesn't entirely understand, or have a difficulty in functioning in our society? And Mark's point is, you have to deal with that. That's a reality. That's not a conceptual thing. That's people in your society have mental or cognitive or physical issues that they can't compete in the same way that other people could compete when they're thrown into the wolves of trying to make ends. And so you've basically, by birth, commissioned those people to poverty and a difficult life. Not act of God and act of policy, because it's a society that allows it. That was his point, that you have to deal with those people. You can't pretend that number of people don't exist and that everybody can get a good, decent job. That wasn't the case. You have to have an honest reality and accounting of our society. But that's one last caller. At least maybe that was the last caller. Was that right, Marie?
Sadly,
and
it looks
Diego
like we had another call, but he dropped. Sadly.
Okay, fair enough. Sadly, call back. We have another call period at 9 o'clock.
We do. Yeah, the one thing. Yeah, so the one thing that you're talking about, the military cutting it off. Are you familiar with Project 100,000?
No.
With McNamara. So back during the Vietnam War, Robert McNamara initiated this project. Basically, you can look it up on Wikipedia. There are books about it, also known as McNamara's Folly, where he brought a bunch of lower IQ floor.
I remember this. Yeah.
Exactly.
McNamara's Fools or something, I thought they call them, because he was trying to bring in low IQ people to do various jobs. Yeah.
Yeah. There are other less polite names than fool for the people that he brought in, but it's sad. It's just, I don't know. It's this example of them, trying to sort people into the wrong category. This also goes back there's a deeper conversation that exists on the history of anarchism, and William Godwin in the West is often pinned as like the founder of at least some of the propositions of early anarchism. And it's just interesting to know. So William Godwin released this essay early on, and then Thomas Malthus actually kind of famously responded to that essay. So William Godwin,
the Malthusian.
Exactly, and in Malthus's response, he basically presented Malthus's response, an essay on the principle of population. He basically presented his ideas. That's how we know Malthus, that people will recreate up to some level.
Yeah, Malthusian was insane. I mean, the Malthusian thing, that's Thanos, basically. It's like you have technology, you have the capability to supply everybody in the entire universe anything that they need, and Thanos' solution is, I'm going to use this technology to just eliminate half of the universe. So the other half can eat.
Yes, yeah.
It's like, well, wait, don't you have the ability to provide everybody with food? What are you doing?
What's interesting is a lot of people say that Malthus was wrong because of technology, but I don't think that's actually right. People will say that Malthus was wrong because technological growth sort of continuously raises the efficiency. You can grow more food, you can have more people, and also people have noted, sort of they lump it in together, that the reproduction rate, the birth rate goes down. But it's weird to me. Those two actually, I mean, they're connected to a certain extent. You have quote unquote development, but I don't know. They don't seem perfectly connected to me, because you can imagine if technological growth were to continue, that growth rate might not necessarily drop to zero. It might just be there's something about the way that we've developed where wages are too low, or where people are disincentivized from having kids. Maybe there's something like that. But anyway, we're getting truly esoteric here, truly wonky. I think we should go into a break. To come back in a minute, we're going to be talking with Lee Camp. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Tune in every Thursday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for a regular segment called Criminal Injustice about the most egregious conduct of our courts and how justice is denied to so many people in this country. Tune in to Loud and Clear this Thursday and every Thursday for thorough and independent analysis of our criminal injustice system.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Camp. We are joined for this segment and the next, thankfully, by Lee Camp, American stand-up comedian, writer, actor, and activist. He also is the host of the weekly comedy news show Redacted Tonight with Lee Camp on RT America. He's also the host of the Common Censored podcast. Lee, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me. It's a new day in America. Very exciting time.
It is, isn't it? Really quick, I just want to give you a shout out. Thank you for introducing us to Eleanor Gold. She's been a great guest. You co-host with her of Common Censored, I believe. So thank you again for that.
Eleanor Goldfield.
Yeah, Eleanor Goldfield's great.
Yeah,
exactly.
Very cool.
Anyway, we're talking about the 2020 election. Like you're saying, a bright new day in America. A Biden-Harris ticket. Real quick, what's your take on that?
The Kamala Harris pick for VP was really just a giant middle finger to any remaining progressives in the Democratic Party. I mean, I don't know how many are sticking it out at this point, but it was just like this nail in the coffin of everything that like Bernie Sanders stood for, and all of his movement. And I mean, she is just the classic corporate pro-prison industrial complex candidate, and this is in the midst, and I'm sure you've talked about this, is in the midst of the largest protest nationwide against racist policing and police brutality and the prison industrial complex that's happened in like a generation. And the Democratic Party was like, let's make our ticket the guy who doubled the prison population, mainly with people of color, with his racist crime bill, and the woman who was the top cop of California and saw fit to imprison people for, smoking weed and because their child was truant. Just complete overuse of law and justice, quote unquote, when there's actually no justice involved.
So this is going to be a big year for a few reasons. I'm just curious, real quick. On the one hand, you have this, like you're saying, a team that is so misrepresentative of the base that I could see it driving a real wedge between the two, like basically weakening the Democratic Party. On the other hand, you have years and years and years of setting Trump up as the worst possible boogeyman ever. So there's this other political force maybe pushing in the opposite direction, maybe pushing for a little bit more voter engagement or something like that, at least the argument goes. How do you think that's going to work out for the DNC?
Yeah, look, the Democrat, Biden, the Biden-Harris tickets could definitely win this. I'm not one of those who think like, oh, because he added Kamala Harris and he's going to lose or whatever. No, we're in the midst of an economic collapse and obviously a pandemic. I mean, we've never really seen these dynamics that it's going into election before. Trump is obviously the most idiotic, childlike, egomaniacal, racist president in years, if ever. And so, yeah, they could definitely win. But that doesn't change the fact that you're not going to get a lot of core change at the heart of what's wrong with this country when you put in two people that go the exact other route, that help Wall Street every chance they get. The biggest donors to Biden throughout his entire career have been, credit companies and banks. Kamala Harris, in order to win her early elections back in California, was like going to get corporate money and bending over for Mnuchin and not prosecuting him when he had over 1,000 foreclosure fraud violations against him. So I absolutely think they could win. I mean, I think it'll come down to how many voters have been purged, which not a lot of people are talking about. Greg Palast has done this great work showing that 17 million people, 1 out of every 12 voters have been purged in this country simply due to residency requirements that are false, acting like they don't live at their house when they do. And that doesn't even count all the other purging that's going to go on. So I think that, Trump could easily win this because of voter purging and their election fraud. And the Democrats could also win this because of the catastrophic times in which we're in.
The Democrats potentially winning this, I don't have a dog in this fight, honestly. And part of me have different feelings with each winning or losing the race. In the Democrats' case, they basically, like you said, a middle finger to lefties, a middle finger to any notion of progressive. I mean, they're going to have Kasich speaking for a full segment with AOC, people who she's widely considered to be the up-and-coming lefty or the bearer of the ring from the standpoint of the lefties, get 60 seconds. Now, this gets across in real terms how not just Biden considers lefties, but how also Democrats consider lefties. And basically, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, part of the reason that they could choose a Kamala Harris for the spot, part of the reason that Biden could win this particular race is because they assume that lefties have nowhere else to go. They assume that regardless of who they choose, whether it's a middle finger to lefties, a middle finger to blacks, again, Kamala Harris was considered Indian for the longest time. She's assuming this particular aspect of her identity for this particular role. But blacks didn't necessarily even choose her in the race. And yet the argument is being made, Joe Biden has chosen a black woman for the spot. Now, we've proven to you by choosing this black woman for the spot that we don't take you guys for granted. I think all of this is indicative of that. How does lefties pull themselves out of this trap? And is the way to pull themselves out of it is to vote for Biden now, and then later on come up with some kind of defense of something else and trying to get your person or your policies pushed? Or is it let Biden fail?
Yeah, well, I'm not one of those who say, the most important thing you have to do is, boycott this election or something like that. I don't believe they'd actually notice if you boycott this election. But I think that the way to actually have a left voice matter is to just get, and I know this isn't the exciting thing to say, this doesn't do well on memes, but is to get involved in a far larger way than your vote in November. If you choose to vote for the Biden-Harris ticket, then don't think it changes the world. Just go about changing the world in many other much more important fashions and areas. Rather than acting like this is it, this is all, this is the thing I'm going to die, the hill I'm going to die on is whether I vote for Harris and Biden. I think that if we really want to create change in this world, because our system has been captured in this way by Wall Street, by corporations, by the prison industrial complex, by the military industrial complex, because it's been captured in this way, whether Biden gets into that office or Trump stays in that office, you're not going to see a whole world of change in those areas. The prison population will keep increasing. The immigrants will keep getting deported. The bombs will keep dropping overseas. And so the change we have to create has to come in other areas. That doesn't mean I don't believe this is worth talking about. I do, but I think if people want to change the world, if you're a quote unquote lefty and you care about peace and decreasing war and death and feeding everybody and those kind of things, then let's all get active in areas other than just only debating who's in the White House.
Lee, I agree with that.
I have a quick question about not necessarily a debate here. I have a quick question, though, about what you guys think would happen if, as we go into this election, we've seen hints of this before. I think the last major upset was, maybe it wasn't just 2016. 2016 was inside DNC corruption. It was probably Bush versus Gore, I think. But again, if you see a serious lack of trust on at least one of the party's sides going into this election on the veracity of the verity of the truth accounts, the verisimilitude of the voting of people, if the numbers are coming in wrong, Republicans and Democrats are both alleging problems with the voter count going into it this year. And then there's also the Electoral College, where a major change happened this year, letting some states effectively redirect their delegates. I mean, I could just see this leading up to a crisis. Does that seem far-fetched to you? Or if that happens, where do you see that going? What's your take, Lee?
Well, the Democrats have really shot themselves in the foot. I mean, maybe they don't think so because they got Biden into the nomination, but they've really shot themselves in the foot by being so fraudulent in their primaries that now they either choose not to talk about the election fraud that goes on in the general, or when they do, everyone kind of rolls their eyes like, you guys rigged your own primaries anyway. So they have no place to speak. They're not able to actually stand up and fight against election fraud. I mean, you're right. We know that in Bush v. Gore should have won that, and he won the popular vote. We know that in Hillary Clinton versus Trump, Hillary won the popular vote. And if you look at the number of people purged through interstate cross-check, she should have won the Electoral College as well. But the mainstream media, the corporate media, the Democrats, the liberals, they hardly speak about, they'll speak about the Electoral College a little, but they hardly speak about all the voters that are being purged because in general they're involved in the primaries. They want to make sure Biden wins that against Bernie Sanders, Hillary wins against Bernie Sanders. So they purge endlessly. They close polling places. They stop people from voting in every way they can possibly think of. And then they go into the general election and they don't have a leg to stand on when they talk about election fraud.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. But the thing is, though, they weren't talking about election fraud even before. I mean, like Sanders came in 2016 where, at that point they needed to try to find a way to stop him in 2016. And I agree with you that they shot themselves in the foot on that too, up until the point where I was just a Democrat, not entirely engaged in the political space. I voted for Nader, but that was almost this kind of unconscious finding yourself politically. I used to think the exact same thing. Oh, the Republicans are the ones that screw with voter ID laws. They're the ones that push through the interstate cross-check stuff. But then you get to 2016 and all of the hijinks that took place in order to stop Sanders, and you get to 2020 and you get Iowa right off the bat that's already going to tell you where this is going. Then I roll my eyes when I hear them talk about cheating in the general.
Yeah, I mean, they came up with whole new ways to cheat in this last primary. I mean, who would have ever heard of we created an app 2 months before the contest that just collapses on the night of the election. They knew that they needed things to be so muddled in the first 3-4 contests that no one really knew what was happening because they knew Bernie was going to blow out the field for the most part. And so they just needed things to be ugly. They needed things to be muddled. They needed people to not be able to vote. They needed people to vote incorrectly. They needed machines to crash. And they did it all. And they did on every step. And then, of course, they got Kamala Harris and the others to drop out all in one night because Bernie was still going to win. So, this has kind of been an endless middle finger to any type of progress. I mean, look at how hard they worked to defeat, via back channels and money and stuff, to defeat the members of the squad, all of which I think have won their primary. But the DCCC and everything have done everything they can because the idea of just those 4 women, just having 4 actual progressives in Congress is too much for the Democratic Party. It's a horror show for them to have this small infection of actually giving a crap and actually wanting to create a better society.
You guys are listening to the voice of Lee Camp, an American stand-up comedian, writer, actor, activist. He hosts the weekly comedy news show Redacted Tonight with Lee Camp on RT America and Common Censored podcast. We'll be back in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik. Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am with my co-host Shane Stranahan. We're joined by Lee Camp. Lee Camp is an American stand-up comedian, writer, actor, and activist. He hosts the weekly comedy news show Redacted Tonight with Lee Camp on RT America and the Common Censored podcasts. Lee, I want to go into a particular area because I agree with you that political activity needs to go beyond the political space. I think part and parcel to our problem is that we've dumped and infused so much energy into politics that we've taken our eye off the ball from the other type of pressure mechanics that could take place when you're outside of the political space. But being outside of the political space also gives you an understanding and puts everybody else on notice that they can't accept your support, or they can't assume your support. They can't necessarily assume that they're going to get this chunk of voters if those people are outside of the political space. And so I agree with you that people need to find other things outside of the space. But I also believe fervently that in this notion of who you vote for and who you're expected to vote for influences behavior. So the reason that they will put a Kasich Republican on the stadium is because they want to reach out to those voters. The reason they would give AOC 60 seconds is because they recognize that AOC has nowhere else to go, and the AOC is going to back Biden regardless. Meaning the notion that lefties, African Americans, Hispanics, many of these groups back the Democrats so fervently that the Democrats don't really have to offer anything. It's rational action on the Democrats' part because they know that all of those people basically have nowhere else to go. Is it not then, if that's true, that part and parcel to any strategy to deal with it is to basically let them know that they will lose if they persist in politics as usual, which is not something that I think we've seen all that often. Meaning even now, most lefties will vote for Joe Biden, regardless of whether he offers anything. Most African Americans would have voted for Joe Biden. They voted Clinton like 90-something%, and Clinton didn't offer anything. And so if these groups don't offer or expect or demand for X and Y, they're not going to get it. Is that, honestly, is that the core of the issue here, when we're looking at the ineffectiveness of the politicians or the reason why Joe Biden could win that race, or for that matter, would choose somebody like Kamala Harris to be his running mate?
Yeah, you're right. And I think we're in a unique time because Trump is outwardly so repulsive that, people that I know who are left wing and agree with most of what I say on my show or whatever, most of the issues I talk about, they're still fervently in the I'm voting for anyone who's going to take Trump out of office. My own parents who love my show, but they can't get enough of talking about how they need to get Trump out of office. So, we're in kind of a unique time in that Trump is, and again, I say outwardly because it's not like previous presidents weren't dropping drone bombs on innocent civilians endlessly and weren't allowing corporations and the richest Americans to collect more money while everyone else is exploited hour by hour at our minimum wage job. So, all those things continue kind of seamlessly between presidents, but Trump is different in that he is so outwardly repulsive. He tweets things that are just disgusting. He says things that are just disgusting, which is also why he's not an acceptable steward for the empire. It's why so many ruling elite, and you mentioned Kasich, but there are many other very wealthy Republicans who are creating ads, heavily funding ads against Trump and everything. And it's not because they're not getting what they want with him. It's because he has accidentally taken the veil off of this empire and revealed it for what it really is. And man, is it disgusting. It is just a pile of vomit when you take the gold sheen off. So they don't like the rulers of this empire don't like that he has revealed it for what it really is. Accidentally, again, I don't want to give him any credit like he's trying to dismantle the empire. He doesn't know what the hell he's doing, but he just acts off impulse, a very childish impulse. And that's why so many of these high-level Republicans want him out of office. But, yeah, I think you're right that, unfortunately, the Democrats do know they can take many of these votes for granted, and therefore they don't feel any need to. Even on the platform, even on the DNC platform, they didn't feel any need to back things like Medicare for all, which most Americans support. How repulsive is that? The platform is borderline meaningless. We saw Bernie get gains on the platform in 2016, and they just basically put them in there for a year and then changed them back. It's so disgusting that's how much money rules our system, in that they take these votes for granted and they don't feel the need to hardly even answer to the people. Biden has said he has no interest in defunding the police. which you've got
But Lee, that's my point.
millions of people across this country willing to be pepper sprayed in the streets for defunding the police.
But that's my point. That, it's like any view of the world is valid. Meaning, if there's no God giving you the kind of point of view, then all of these various points of view have their merits, providing that the person is willing to accept the world that's created from the logic of that point of view. If Joe Biden and the Democratic Party knows almost as a flat fact that all of these people will back him in order to get rid of Trump, meaning he doesn't have to do anything, how is it not a rational act for Joe Biden and the Democratic Party to do exactly what they're doing? Meaning, if we can get away with it, then we're going to get away with it, especially if we have the leverage to ensure that the public can't do anything about it. Like, for example, let's say Tom Cotton goes against Hillary Clinton in the next election. Aren't those people going to be saying the exact same thing that they're saying right now with Trump? Add it up, Ted Cruz, same thing. Like, how is the Democratic Party wrong if they're taking a political tact where they know that they basically have the public over a barrel?
But you could argue that they didn't get away with it in 2016. I mean, they lost the election because they defrauded Bernie Sanders out of the nomination. And even if they'd put in Hillary Clinton but had her change some of her stances to basically align with Bernie in order to actually speak to progressive voices, she very well may have won that election. I mean, if she'd done it with enthusiasm, not just a little thing here or there. She very well may have won that. So, they don't always get away with it. They could very well lose this election based on the purged voting and everything else because if they were to actually stand or even pretend to stand, if they put in another woman of color like Tulsi Gabbard or Nina Turner as the VP, maybe that would have spoken to progressives. And you're right. Maybe then they'd have a much easier time, quote unquote, getting away with it. Because it seems that they're speaking to progressives. I mean, they failed to get away with it in 2016.
I mean, it's not
Do you think that in the same way that the 2016? Well, just briefly. I mean, with 2016 was a window into how the DNC works, or at least how it worked at that time. And you can only assume that it's gotten worse. Do you think that if Trump were to win in 2020, that would perversely be another incentive for the DNC to do some genuine reforms, or is that just me playing devil's advocate? What do you think, Lee?
Interregnum.
No, I don't see that, because the reason I don't see that is because the truth is the moneyed interests behind the DNC that rule the DNC, that rule the most of Democrats in the Congress, 90% or something. They are more scared. It is more of an existential threat to them that Bernie Sanders get traction or that the squad get traction. That is what they truly fear. They don't like Trump and they want him out of office, and he is gutting many government agencies in a way that destroys them more than past efforts. But really, as they've proven, they're more afraid of Bernie Sanders than they are of Donald Trump. If they wanted to definitely win this election, they would have allowed Bernie Sanders to run a legitimate campaign. He would have won the nomination, and they would have won the election. But that's not what they want. They're more afraid of the ideas coming out of the actual progressive tiny wing of their party.
Well, here's my take. Here's my rejoinder with this one. In 2016, Trump had not yet come to pass. And the assumption that I think a lot of people had early in his presidency, after he'd won the election, was that if they oppose him categorically, if they do everything they can to reveal, the bad stuff he's doing and to just tarnish him generally, that there's a chance that either by the next election, or at the next election with either an impeachment or a re-election, they could pretty effectively take him out, because I think a lot of people met his first election with pretty much complete shock and awe. But if the investor class, who you're right does rule the DNC, sees the DNC failing to get what it wants the second time, even when everything has been made clearer during a crisis, everything, I just think I think the investor class, the money, might think there's some better way to do it, and I think they might be forced, whether it's the people who's doing it or the higher ups, to try to reorganize it. And with that reorganization, I think there's a potential for some genuine change. What's your take on that, Lee?
I mean, I don't know. It's the same as I just said. I don't really see that.
Fair enough.
I don't really see them choosing to give up their power or I mean, think about the key things that Bernie Sanders are, Medicare for all and, ending big oil and, maybe some degree of foreign policy change. But those things, if those were successful and they did them and they stood behind them, then if people could see how important that is, how pivotal it is, how much it contributes to people's health, and that type of thing can become infectious. And I mean that in a good way. You give people free health care, and all of a sudden they think, wow, government can actually work for us and create a better society. And maybe we should also give people free college education. It's the threat of the good example. And I think they fear that more than anything, which is why you never, ever, ever see large-scale congressional change for something the people of America want that is not supported by big corporations. And the last example, people try and give is Obamacare, but Obamacare was supported by big corporations. They had to set it up so that it was supported by the moneyed interest. And that's the world our government lives in.
Yeah, the best solution is out of reach. I mean, even Chris Matthews says something similar in one of those rants that he was given on one of the panel things. I think it was during the time that Sanders had won one of the states. And Matthews made the point, hey, maybe it's better to throw this one away, basically let Trump win this, and as opposed to having Sanders change the party for a generation. So these guys, the last thing that they want is to have, let's say, a Medicare for all program that works in the way that it's supposed to work, in which case people start thinking, hey, maybe we can have some other program that would do something similar. No, I 1,000% agree with you on this one, Lee. So what's the solution to this and what changes? So let's say for the moment that Joe Biden wins this. Nothing's going to take place from the positive from the standpoint of Israel. Both of these guys are in alignment. From the standpoint of the economic space, nothing that much is going to change. Joe Biden himself has already said that. Kamala Harris backtracked on Medicare for all. She laughed at terrorizing a mother who's homeless. So that gives you some idea, at the very least, about where her head is on this stuff. It just seems like it's going to be performative politics 101. And I guess my biggest fear is that if Biden wins, they go back to this mindset of thinking, okay, everything is great again. The protest, the Trump is gone, so now maybe blacks will stop protesting, and well, whites in many of these states too. It was mixed race, which was protesting. I guess my thought is, my hope or my concern is that people think that when Joe Biden gets elected, they've gone back to sleep, and they've gone back to this kind of Obama era of thinking about politics, whereas there were still real, persistent issues in the country before Donald Trump ever took office.
1 minute.
Is 30 seconds. What do you think about that, Lee?
Well,
I guess my thought is, and I know we only have about 30 seconds, but how do you mind that gap? How do you, as a group, fix that? Because it doesn't necessarily seem like our politics allows a way to do so.
I think this is a little different than when Obama got into office, because although inequality was gut-wrenching then, you didn't have the full level economic collapse we're facing with thousands of businesses going out of business. You didn't have the environment collapsing around us with forest fires raging across the country. I think that things are getting pushed to a point that the politicians can't ignore them any longer. And the change will come in the street, as we're seeing with the defund the police movement. The change must come from the bottom up. You can't just expect a Joe Biden to change things.
Very cool. Lee Camp, you've been listening to American stand-up comedian, writer, actor, and activist. He hosts the weekly comedy show Redacted Tonight with Lee Camp on RT America and Common Censored podcast. Lee, thank you again for joining us. We'll be back in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And we're back live from the divided states of America. It is time for the last hour today of the most disruptive show in American politics, in the whole universe's politics. Let's take it up to that highest standard. In the politically independent corner, I am your radio show host, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last man on the wall, with my co-host Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I really hit the bottom of my register there. Yeah. All right. Let's go into headlines here. We do these every morning at 7, 8, and 9 a.m. Eastern, 4, 5, and 6 a.m. Pacific. That's my time. I'm on the West Coast. Jamarl's on the East Coast. We really do straddle the United States of America. In the headlines, this is new here. 963,000 U.S. workers sought jobless aid this week. That's the first time in 5 months that new weekly claims have fallen below 1 million. So jobs are coming back apparently, but jobless aid is still high. A number of new requests, again, almost 1 million. But it seems like we've turned a corner because, again, that is the first time in 5 months, really since the beginning of this crisis, that new weekly claims have fallen below 1 million. Again, interesting there. Presidential candidate in our next headline. Presidential candidate and former Vice President Joseph Biden and current Vice Presidential candidate Kamala Harris appeared together in Delaware as running mates for the first time yesterday, with Harris attacking President Trump over his response to the coronavirus, saying that the reason the coronavirus has hit the U.S. harder than any other country is, quote, because of Trump's failure to take it seriously from the start, end quote. The Biden campaign said it raised $26 million in one day following his announcement that Harris would be his VP pick. And 538, the website, Nate Silver thing, 538 is currently saying Biden has a 72% chance to win the election. President Trump, meanwhile, has said he's looking forward to the debate between Vice President Pence and Senator Harris, saying that it should be better than Pence's debate with Tim Kaine, Hillary's running mate back in 2016. The decision to switch to a new reporting system for COVID cases is proving disruptive, as many in the system are reporting serious delays in the public release of hospital data. This comes nearly a month after the federal government ordered states to report directly to the Department of Health and Human Services, bypassing the Centers for Disease Control and Security. Important data, like the number of beds occupied by coronavirus hospital patients, is now lagging by a week or more. The head of the CDC, Robert Redfield, has issued a dire request asking people to follow 4 steps or risk, quote, the worst fall from a public health perspective we've ever had, end quote. Those 4 steps are to wear a mask, social distance, wash your hands, and be smart about crowds. The head of the EPA is today set to reverse Obama-era regulations on greenhouse gas emissions, specifically on the release of methane. The new rule eliminates requirements that oil and gas companies must install technology to detect and fix methane leaks from wells, pipelines, and storage sites. New EPA officials say that the regulation rollbacks are needed to free the oil and gas industry from crippling regulations. In our next headline, damage assessments are continuing in the Midwest in the aftermath of this week's windstorms. Many farmers there lost their crops, with Iowa and Illinois hit the hardest. And while the Illinois Farm Bureau says that it's too early to estimate crop losses, many fields are reportedly completely flattened, with damage to structures also widespread. There have also been reports of widespread infrastructure damage in the states. And last, Sheriff Billy Woods of the Marion County Sheriff's Office is telling staff to not wear masks when on duty, except for in a few key circumstances, specifically when they're at the courthouse, in schools, in hospitals, and while on patrol and responding to a nursing home or an incident involving a, quote, high-risk elderly individual, end quote. In an email sent to his department on August 11th, just a few days ago, Sheriff Woods wrote that the fact is the amount of professionals that give the reason why we should wear masks, that is, I can find the exact same amount of professionals that say why we shouldn't. This came as Marion County reported 13 deaths on Tuesday alone, its own single-day record. And you're all caught up. That's the news. Those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. Yeah, I want to follow up on that real quick, actually. There's this crisis of medical authority, which you can see, not just in the public, not just in in the huge amount of uncertainty that the public seems to have about what's going on with the virus. And I'm not even haven't taken sides on that in this statement yet or whatever, anything I've said here. But it's just interesting. And I mean, it's interesting to look at this historically. One thing I'm going to bring up here before I pass it over to you, Jamarl, we can take the conversation. We're also taking calls, 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. But there's this idea back that in the early to mid 20th century, you had the decline of the public intellectual, or specifically in this case, the public scientist, the public thinker in sort of scientific domains, where if you think back early 20th century, I mean, in physics, you have a bunch of standouts. You have Richard Feynman, you have Albert Einstein, who, moved outside of science and into politics. And then moving into the late 20th century and into the 21st century, you sort of have the decline of the status or the standing of those individuals in society. And you have the rise of institutions. You have the rise of institutionalized medicine and institutionalized science. And the problem, I think, with that, there are a few problems. Maybe you have some like decay that comes from the institution stagnating. Maybe you have some stuff like that happening. But another problem is that if people are angry at the institutions of their government, if people are angry at the central institutions and they've come to distrust them, in many cases probably for good reason, then they're going to be angry at the science too. It's sort of transitive. And I don't feel like you really have any people out there. I mean, who's the prominent epidemiologist? At this point, it's arguably Fauci. But people obviously didn't really know him until this crisis started. It's not like he had his own platform or people were already conversant with his ideas. None of that stuff has happened. Instead, things are very institutional. And so people are angry at these institutions and they're pushing back at the authorities within those institutions, speaking from those institutions. And I think it carries through to the science too. And that's, again, I haven't taken any sides yet at all. It's just from this wider systemic perspective, I think that might be contributing to it. Does that make sense to you,
No,
Jamarl?
I think I know where you're going with that. So I think there are a few points. I think I do agree that Fauci is probably the lead person on this. But the public, I would agree with that if the public looked at Fauci and said, we're not feeling him. But the administration, for the most part, is the one that gets the blame from the standpoint of the public saying, we don't like what you're doing. And it's the scientists that are in the group, either the CDC, the World Health Organization, Fauci, whatever, are the ones that get the highest accolades from the public to the tune of like 60, 70%. I do think, though, that there is something to be said about a discrediting effect that we're noticing or that we're seeing. And that's what I think you're trying to get to the root of. Why the discrediting of experts, of people who supposedly should know what they're talking about, even if they get it wrong. They're people, so they're not going to be perfect. But why it seems like a part of the society is undermining those experts. I think the thing is, though, that it's a political issue. That the moment that it becomes an issue of politics, the issue of right, wrong, the issue of reality, all of those things become subordinate to whatever the politics is. So if we're having a conversation about climate change and we understand it as a scientific issue, where scientists are saying, look, we're putting stuff in the atmosphere that's going to bother us later on. And then you have a political actor that says, yeah, but the stuff that we're putting in the atmosphere, it's expensive for me to find somewhere else to dump that. So it's easier for me to pay a portion of the money that I make from dumping that stuff in the atmosphere and give it to give it to people who can do these studies and come up with certain assessments. They can give it to think tanks. They come up with certain ideas and rationalizations of the world, and even give it to certain newspapers like the New York Times, who would write stories as if they were coming from their editorial board, where it said it was coming from people in this company saying that they're going to be part of the green economy. Like it's that. It's like the moment that it becomes this is politically or this information, this reality, is politically disadvantageous to us, then at that point, it's a politics issue. And so whether it becomes, we don't want to, companies should be able to dump that stuff and the government supposedly should deal with the negative externalities of it. And so you have one party that basically says climate change is a hoax and it's not real. Or whether that's this virus where you have a large segment on the left and right, meaning Democrat and Republican, that want to get these people back to work as soon as possible. They want to do it because in their heads, the owner class, who dumps tons of money in their pockets, wants them to do it. Not to mention they agree with the ideology, like Nancy Pelosi said, I'm a capitalist. Now, there may be a subjective distance between where Republicans and Democrats are on this issue, but I still think both clearly want to get those people back to work as soon as possible and want to, even if it means pushing them into work. Now, they may be able to use the politics and everything else for their own fodder. But in this very specific case, I really do believe that the issue of reality is because it's been politicized. And whether that's politicized reality around masks and the efficacy and the safety involved in trying to prevent the transmission of this particular illness, whether that's with climate change, and pretty much anything else that come up, where the moment that it becomes politicized, it becomes a factor of where reality itself becomes subordinate to just whatever the politics. I think this is where this comes in. So I don't necessarily think I entirely disagree with you. I think I know where you're trying to get at. You're trying to hit at this nub of why on earth is there a devolution of the individual or of the scientist? Like, for example, NASA. During the point where NASA was in existence, you had all of these kids who would look up to the skies and says, I'm going to be one of those people who are flying in spaceships. And they had all of these aspirations about, working on a spaceship, flying around in space. I want my flying car, that type of stuff. They wanted their Star Trek universe. And as long as you had a NASA that was trying to get to the moon and everything else, you had a public that was focused on that. And so by definition, you would have people who would want to go into the sciences, who care more about those things. That could even be something like watching Star Trek that puts people in that perspective. But when that goes away, and that's not there anymore, and NASA gets deprioritized under Obama, you have, there is no scientific institution that is kind of there, that is persistent, where people can kind of accrue their thoughts around. So you get these crises ever so often, and as people pop up in a crisis, like you said, with Fauci or somebody, people was like, okay, I like that guy, I dislike that guy. But I think if we're looking for an emancipation of scientists and of research and whatnot, let people go to school without putting tons of debt on their backs and come up with public projects that focuses the public attention on something that we as a society are putting our collective energies around doing that is not necessarily easy, but is worthwhile because of the intellectual and physical capabilities necessary to even do it. That's how you bring science into the forefront. You keep it in the forefront. That's my thought. I mean, if that's where we're trying to get to, where there's a more rational, in a scientific way, about how we function as a society, how our world functions, and how we can have a more organized world. Like I said, the problem is you have some people who don't want an organized world. They just want what they want, and you come into problems. We have Rod from Philly. If you don't want to respond to that, Shane.
Yeah, let's. If the conversation brings us back, we can. But let's just go straight to Rod from Philly. Okay. Rod, you're on. What's going on, Rod?
Hey, good morning, guys. Yeah, I wanted to follow up on you guys talking about science, and as far as science and politics, though, politics have bled into science. Science is politicized. I learned this about 10 years ago. I was in a long-term relationship with a woman who was a doctor right after medical school, and she would have to read peer-reviewed journals, and even she would tell me that it wasn't. She would only have to read it as a requirement, not as a education, because whoever funded the study was the ones who would be slanted to. And the perfect example is we had a Kamala Harris who's she's de facto running for president. Joe Biden's not, he's just an empty vessel. And she said that every 80 seconds, someone dies from the coronavirus. Now that is amazing because the math doesn't add up. But nobody corrected her. Not one, not PolitiFact, not any of no scientists, nobody's corrected her on any stage that we would hear about. But she was able to say that. She was able to say that Barack Obama was perfect in handling Ebola and only 2 people died. That's amazing. I mean, he must be the Harry Potter of viruses, and he just make them disappear. So, politics has bled into science, and whoever funds it. So someone like Fauci, I mean, he just came out and said, well, he doesn't trust the Russian vaccine, but look at what the Americans put in the vaccines. They use a form of mercury. I can't say it right now, but there's a form of mercury that's in vaccines. You can look it up. And at the same time, you can also Google this or search it. They were using fetuses to cultivate vaccines, baby fetuses. So, efficacy and the science itself is all politicized. And I'm telling you, coming from the science background, working as a DNC, the whole thing has been politicized. That's why people don't trust it, because they have a feeling that the gut tells them there's something wrong. But then when the facts are backing it up and say, yeah, this is all politically financed and hindering the American public, I mean, just look at what's in our food. I mean, why did they switch from sugar to high fructose corn syrup, knowing that it harms people? But you weren't given a warning or a advisory. So politics is bled into almost everything.
Right. Thank you for the call.
Rod, we've
Yeah.
got to go to a break, but really, thank you for the call. I agree. We're going to come back on this. Going to keep talking about it. We are still taking calls on anything you'd like to talk about. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
Man, we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines. By the way, my name is Shane Stranahan. I am joined by my co-host, Jamarl Thomas, and we are coming to you from across the country. Formerly, we would have come to you from our station in D.C., but with COVID, we're kind of spread out right now. Things are we're laying low, let's just say that. We are also taking calls this segment, 202-521-1320. That's the number to call, 202-521-1320. Oh, and if you want to catch us on the radio in D.C., you can, 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. That's where we're on there. In Kansas City, we're also on the air on radio, 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM. And you can also find us online. We are on Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, and Spotify. Those are our audio options. For video, your best bet is probably to go to youtube.com, do a search for Jamarl Thomas, and you will find there almost every morning, practically every morning. There was a brief interval of problems, but practically every morning you'll find Jamarl's bright and smiling face. I will sometimes appear as a gray, a black and white disembodied head. If that sounds exciting or, grim, either way, you can go and check that out. Just do a search for Jamarl Thomas on YouTube. Also, while you're there, do a search for Fault Lines Radio. We have a long-running channel there, and that is the channel for the show. So go ahead and subscribe to that. We're also over on twitter.com/faultlinesradio. You can see a Periscope feed right up top if that's your preferred method of intake. But again, we're taking calls, 202-521-1320. Back to the conversation, though, for a second. On science, one thing I'll bring up here, I was talking about the government. Actually, I didn't even frame it in these terms, but I've heard it put in these terms. The idea that the government intentionally, at some key moments during the 20th century, suppressed the opinions and voices of key scientists. I mean, this doesn't sound that controversial, but think about it like this. Coming out of the 40s, you have the successful Manhattan Project with some very smart and prominent physicists with connections and influence, having just gone through this extremely ambiguous and disheartening moral journey where they created nuclear weaponry. And over the next couple of decades, nuclear weapons were going to be, one of the chief world focuses in terms of the threats and the potential fallout, pun not intended. So there were serious problems there. And then you had this wave, and this is just taking one issue, for example. You can see how this works. If scientists are opposing the use of nukes, that's not necessarily in the U.S. government's best interests. And so what the U.S. government did, it seems, was to push back and suppress those scientists. And the way they did this, because they need science, is to replace the voices of individual people with institutions. Now, Jamarl, your solution at the end of the last segment was to sort of support people going into schools. Now, my problem with that, and I'm just going to end it right here, I'm worried that the schools themselves have been co-opted, that if we send people into schools, we're kind of, okay, we're back to an even deeper problem, which is that our schools for a much longer period of time than the problem I'm describing have been built essentially to create conformist robots who will both be good consumers and good workers and relatively complacent members of your civil society. What's your take on that? I mean, don't you see that? Do you see that as something we need to change? Do you think that's also valid? Or
No, I think that's valid. I mean, look, the problem is that reality doesn't give you a way out. Like there's no point where you can go and say, all right, this is God's point of view where I can put my hand on this stake because God said it, and there go, I can, the creator of the cosmos or something. We don't have that. I mean, we're basically stuck, washed in points of view and opinions where we're trying to organize and keep a sustainable society. And what that means is drastically different from person to person to person. No, the reason why I say send people to school, I'm not talking about school from the standpoint of them learning life skills. I'm talking about more specific in the sense that if you want a society that is exemplary of, let's say, a scientific method, and scientists can be dogmatic because they're human beings also, but I would think it's two things. I think it's one, you have projects that puts people's focus and attention on that science and on the fact that your society is trying to push the limits of technological capabilities as you meet those limits. Meaning when Kennedy said we're going to the moon, Kennedy had no idea how they were going to get to the moon. None. But they did it. And within 10 years, they figured it out. I'm making the point that even though that might have been a militaristic endeavor, you had all sorts of people who were drawn into science during that particular moment. Like you say, Einstein used to be a celebrity. And you have a hard time thinking of a celebrity science. Maybe, what is his name? Neil deGrasse Tyson or Kaku.
Michio Kaku,
yeah.
But here's one brief point on those guys. Yeah. They are pretty prominent voices, but as far as I can tell, they have literally no unique discoveries under their belt.
Exactly.
They're not independent. They haven't discovered anything. They're just sort of representative of the history over the last century of advances in astronomy and physics.
No, I agree with that part. I guess I'm saying it's two parts. It's have projects that people can dedicate their attention and focus to, and that keep people aspiring to be part of these organizations, meaning NASA or some other kind of technological thing that your government decides to do. But secondary, if people have the capacity to go to school to the degree that they want to go to school, you will have more people just by probability alone to go into the scientific fields. I'm saying you feed the beast. You create the beast in one sense by creating this large governmental project that builds and does something that's beneficial to all mankind, if not the community and society itself. And second, you feed that beast by ensuring that people can go to school for science and for mathematics and for some of these things that would be able to work with those projects. I'm saying that your society dedicates a certain amount of attention to it. But your point is correct, that many times these type of organizations just create robots. Like when you're going to school at an early age, you're just going there to conform. Here's the information, conform. And you go out and you repeat the information that was given to you by that particular school, and we consider that to be knowledge. So I agree with you on that point. That point is a little bit, that's a whole nother issue in regards to how do you deal with your schools in a way that tries to enhance imagination. Or
okay, so that's my sort of more rock solid argument. Yeah. I have a slightly more transgressive argument that I've heard and that I've thought about that I'm a little bit more on, but I can bring to the court here. And that's the argument that maybe there just aren't enough people in society who should be scientists, and we should try to stop encouraging so many people to go into it. Now I'm going to lay this argument out a little bit more. We were talking earlier about the 85 IQ limit or whatever. I don't know how much I fully buy into that stuff, but you can take it as a sort of first attempt.
Well, but there are people in your society that are mentally ill, or not even considered mentally ill, but just not capable. Like my uncle, love him to death. He's passed now, but he could have never functioned in society in any normal way, even though he wouldn't have considered, he would have been considered handicapped per se, but he wasn't altogether there. I have family members that are that way. I know people that are that way. And so it's not an undermining thing. It's not a racial thing. It's just that there are going to be some people who are born in your society that have who are not up to snuff, let's say mentally, for whatever reason. And those people shouldn't necessarily have difficult, horrible, poverty-filled lives for something that they had no control over. That's all we mean by that part.
Totally.
So it's not
totally.
Yeah.
No, I hear you on that. No, I didn't even really want to tarry with that one. It was just this idea that maybe we shouldn't be encouraging a bunch of people to go into science. Because here's the other thing: if they go to the universities and you have too many people, if you think about it like this, if there are a certain amount of people who are going to come up with amazing discoveries that really advance the frontier of what's possible and what we know and what we can test, if you're going to have a certain amount of people who are doing that, and then you have a bunch of other people who are sort of operating within the same space and competing for tenure, playing political games basically, then what you might get is a situation where your intellectual system, the academia is so overrun with rent seekers, basically, people who haven't advanced the field but are basically trying to maintain their stake after they were encouraged to get into this. I mean, another way of looking at this is that maybe this is just a wrong way to view the economy, that we shouldn't be trying to encourage everybody to go to college. We should be encouraging more people to go to trade schools. We should be making sure that the wages for going to, for instance, trade schools are raised so that it's a more respectable and prestigious position and people don't feel like they're taking a loss or wasting their life. Another way to look at this is that maybe the view of human nature we should have shouldn't be that everybody should excel intellectually and that's the sort of barometer for society, but that instead we should have a wider spectrum. You know what I mean? So there are these different variations of the argument, but I think there's something to it. I'm not sold on it completely. But
I'm sold on that argument.
We are also, by the way.
No, I agree.
We're taking calls, 202-521-1320, and we have a caller. But Jamarl.
Well, I was just going to say, I agree with that. I mean, like, I don't know how people can agree with that. Like, look, your society has certain things that it needs. And from a perspective of the society, whether it's notion of good and bad, or whether it's notion of productive versus not, there are some things that are more productive than others. You're not going to have a huge number of people being, let's say, Bill Gates. I don't think that's going to happen, or the creators of Google. Those people are usually a small number of people. I think the thing that society is trying to encourage, though, at least in my head, it's not so much that I need everybody to go to school. I don't even need everybody to work, per se. So need is not necessarily there. What I would want, though, is for people who actually do want to be a doctor, go to be a doctor. For people who want to go to school for their masters, to go do, like, meaning I want people to be encouraged to fulfill their abilities to whatever extent that is. And in the context of school, it starts to some degree there with them learning some trait or something else. Now, if we reorganize that, fair enough. I'm not even necessarily hard on this notion of how those skills are appropriated. I don't need for everybody to go to school. And I don't even know if it's productive for everybody to go to school in that way.
Well, and here's another, well, you know what? I kind of want to get my thing in, but we do have Sebel calling in from DC. I feel like we should get to her. If you're down, we only have like 2 minutes left. But
No. Let's get to the callers.
Let's do it. All right. Sebel calling in from DC. Did I get your name right, first off? And second of all, how are you doing this morning?
Oh, I'm doing well. Thank you. Subway. Yeah, you got it.
Okay, Sebel, thank you. Yeah, so what were you calling in about this morning?
So no, I was actually going to talk about, I don't know if you've ever heard of, what's his name? Ben Cohn, I think that's his name. He was, he talked about kind of like reimagining the way that we actually educate people as far as like eliminating grades or just kind of teaching a critical thinking, eliminating competition. I don't know if that's exactly what you were talking about just now, but I feel like sometimes it's not even just about like the kind of people that you're going to produce, but rather how you're educating the people that are going to be something, if that makes any sense.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I mean, one way of looking at this is that depending on what you're bringing somebody up to do, so say you're looking at it from the perspective of the student, that student might have a conviction or an idea about what they want to become. And if there are people who are like that, or even if you have a sense of an inclination, what you want to do is sort of accelerate that as much as possible. Just give them as many tools to pursue that. And an education system that's bent on doing that for individual people meeting their needs, instead of out of necessity trying to sort of meet the lowest common denominator in terms of testing and training and teaching and everything. I haven't heard of that guy. How do you spell his name so I can look into him a little bit more?
Tim Cohn. He's been around forever. Yeah. Sorry, not Tim. Alfie Cohn.
Okay, Alfie. Okay. Yeah. I mean, look, I agree with her. I mean, I think we should reorganize that stuff. I mean, there's never been a demarcation point where we look back at our society and say, what has changed? Meaning, like, for example, the moment that you become technologically precise enough to be able to build an automated place to create food, why don't you do it? It cuts the cost of food and ensures that people can have it, that there are no food deserts. We don't do it. There is no reorganization. We just kind of lurch from place to place. And I think that takes us in bad spots sometimes. But we're going to take a break here. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming up will be Carmine Sabia. You don't want to miss that one. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most...
I believe it's Sabia.
As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking.
Oh, thank you, Xavier.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Tune in every Friday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for a weekly segment of the worst mainstream media headlines of the week. They tell us what's behind the worst, most misleading, and funniest headlines from around the news with Steve Patt of the blog Left Eye on the News. Together, they pull apart the corporate media's bias, spin, and downright lies. Tune in this Friday and every Friday for the worst and most misleading headlines of the week.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Sabia. We're joined for this segment and the next by Carmine Sabia. He's a writer and editor at large at SabiaReport.com. Carmine, how are you doing this morning?
How are you?
Good. It's good to have you. Thank you for joining us. This is the first time we've had you on in a couple of months since the switchover, and you used to come on pretty frequently. Like to see how this goes. Maybe we can have you on pretty frequently too. But I'm glad to hear you're doing well. I'd like to get into. We're planning on talking about the 2020 election. Obviously, big changes in the last couple of days, confirming wide suspicions that Kamala would be the VP. She now is. So we'll just start there. What's your take on that? Where do you think this is going to go?
Not surprised. It was the easy pick, right? It was definitely an easy pick. I think it was a bad choice on Biden's part. I think it was a great choice for Trump, and it was a great choice for the Republicans because there's so much to pick apart. There's so much to pick apart there. Her criminal justice history. It's interesting to me that one of the biggest things the Democrat Party, especially the young people in the Democrat Party, are all in arms about is the criminal justice system and criminal justice reform and defund the police. And they pick a prosecutor responsible for a lot of people in jail and a lot of it on petty stuff. That's a very interesting pick if you're trying to get the young vote out.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense to me. From that perspective alone, especially with this stuff brewing, that's the one thing where I would have thought they would have seriously rethought that decision. I mean, it seemed feasible, and it still did seem feasible, but it had just been an increasingly large nail in what seemed to be her coffin as his VP pick. I don't know. What's your take on that, Jamarl?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm sorry. Well, that's a good question. So let me push it to Carmine. Why do you think they chose her then? If she was one of the worst picks that you could have chosen at a time, I mean, again, it's like whether you agree or disagree with defund the police stuff, that was the pitch that was being made, and for Joe Biden to choose basically a cop is a little weird. And so why do you think he chose that? I have my own reasons for thinking that, but let's get yours. What is the rationale for Kamala Harris if it does indeed go against basically the mainstream?
There's reasons, right, that I'm definitely confused about. But number one, he limited his field. First, he said, I'm going to pick a woman. So now you've really limited your field, okay? Because there's not a lot of women traditionally in these positions as far as in politics with the experience. We're still working towards that, but it's not 50-50 yet. So you've limited your field to just women who are in this arena, okay? And now you've said, well, basically you're painted into a corner by your party that not only does it have to be a woman, it has to be a woman of color. So now you have severely limited your field. And then the number of qualified applicants has shrunk tremendously that you can choose from because you have really you have to check boxes. You have to check certain boxes instead of worrying about who's the most qualified, who's the most electable. I got to check certain boxes. She's got to be a woman. You got to be a woman of color. I'm sure if he could have found a lesbian woman of color that had the qualifications, that would have been another box. They would have went there. It's just the way it is. And if they could have found a transgender lesbian woman of color, off to the races. Okay, but I think I think he painted himself in a corner, and his options were so limited
that it was like Kamala Harris or Susan Rice, because he needed somebody with name value too, which also limits your options. And I think he went the wrong name, because he might have thought, hey, look, if I get Susan Rice, I got the Benghazi issue. Okay, great. But that's kind of been adjudicated already. If you go and Kamala Harris has a lot of skeletons in the closet, man, and a lot of stuff. Susan Rice had one thing, Benghazi. You know what I mean? I think it was an infinitely more qualified choice.
Do you think this hurts him? I mean, personally, I got to be honest. I think Kamala Harris is a nothing choice. I don't think it helps or hurts in a real, tangible way. But do you think it actually injures him? You think it hurts him?
It hurts him. It hurts him because you've just spent the whole summer on defund the police, reform criminal justice, and you picked a cop. How are you going to excite the young people that you need to excite? Because you can't win this race without young people voting. How are you exciting them to vote for Kamala Harris? Again, this woman couldn't win California. She couldn't win California.
So another side of this then is that the Biden campaign, on the other hand, just raised like $26 million in a day after choosing her. So the official fundraising numbers are way up, but I can't help but agree with what you're saying. I don't think that younger people, or really anybody who's been paying attention or has any sense of common sentiment with the protests, I don't think they're going to like this. And on this show, certainly with the guests, I mean, obviously we're biased. We are our own show. We're seeing that borne out. But what do you think this is going to look like for the Democrats? Especially, it seems like they're spending a lot of money. It seems like they're raising a decent amount of money too. What do you think? What do you think this is going to look like if they flail and fail after having raised apparently and spent record amounts of money?
Money doesn't win elections. People, that's a common misconception. They way outspent Trump in 2016. Money doesn't win elections. It helps, but it doesn't win elections. I don't know, because you think they would have kind of rethought that after 2016, but apparently they didn't. So what does it look like for them after that? I don't know. As far as I can see right now, and I think this is the big problem Democrats are faced with, and not that I'm trying to help them, but they have no star. There's no shining star in that party. There's no, hey, this is the one. There's no Obama in that party right now. He can't run again. And there's after all these years, there's still no heir apparent to the young, charismatic, good-looking President Obama. They got nothing. And
it seems like the closest they've come was with the Squad and maybe AOC, but I think she's still seen, even among Democrats, arguably, even among younger Democrats. I was going to say among older Democrats, but probably pretty broadly, she's still seen as kind of naive. That's the sense that I get. And whether that's true or not, I think you're right. She's not an Obama. Nobody sees her like that.
She's not a star that could be president.
Right. She's not even old enough. I mean, it's just not there. I don't think the gravitas is there yet. Yeah, I have a hard time seeing who's next in the stable either, especially if you're going to work on identity. Meaning, it's one thing if you're running on policy, where it's like, these are the policies I want the audience and the people are voting for you because of specific items. It's another thing when it's an identity pick. And that's what this is. I mean, that by definition, it's what it is, right? I mean, the moment that you say I'm going to vote for a woman, then it's going to have to be a person of color, and then et cetera, et cetera. Right, I agree with you. You cut down. I don't think just saying it's going to be a woman cuts down your number. I mean, as a technical sense, yes. But you have so many people that could make that up. I think women make up like 50%, 51% of the group. But I do think the closer you get, the further they're into, okay, the person has to be a person of color, have a certain amount of experience, have to get along with Joe Biden, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I do think, though, but considering that 70% of the population is voting for Joe Biden because of Joe Biden, who Joe Biden is not, does that still hurt him? Like, it's one thing if they were voting for you because of some affirmative choice, but the moment that the choice becomes basically, it's not Trump, then you can pretty much get away with nearly anything. He could have chose a ham sandwich for his VP for all it mattered, and it would have gotten him pretty much the same bang for the buck. Or am I wrong on that?
No, you're right. You're right. For the people who are just going to vote against Trump, this means nothing. But for the people who actually want something with a plan. You got, look, Kamala Harris is not the future of the party. She might think so, but she's not. At least not if they want to win anything. I think Pete Buttigieg is the future of the party, honestly.
Now, why? Why do you think Pete is the future of the party? Explain.
Let me put it this way. If the Democrats want to win anything again, Pete Buttigieg is the future of the party. Because he's not a nut. Because he's not a lunatic. He's not a far-left wackadoo. He actually has ideas. And listen, I'm not a Buttigieg fan. Obviously, we disagree. But he's not a lunatic. He's a normal guy who just happens to disagree with my politics, but he's not crazy.
No,
that's interesting.
Crazy.
That's very interesting.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Jamarl.
Yeah. No. Go ahead. I think I'm looking at this in the same way that you are, Shane. Where it's like, oh, that's an interesting thought. Why is Pete Buttigieg the future? So no, go ahead, Shane. Take it. I'm sorry.
Well, no. It's just I'm a centrist, pretty weird dude, but definitely neither a Democrat nor a Republican. Carmine, just checking. You're definitely a Republican. You're a Christian conservative Republican, still Trump supporter, but you have some reservations. Just not to pin you down, but just to give a sense, right?
I'm pretty far right, bro. Yeah.
Okay, for sure. Yeah, and then we have Jamarl, obviously progressive. It's just interesting that you see Buttigieg as a valid candidate. Also interesting to think about what the DNC would look like if he were their future. What a Buttigieg DNC would look like in terms of its policies, in terms of where he would take it, or where it would go if they aligned themselves with him. Just interesting to think about. Also interesting if you're right, and we're sort of caught out of left field, and we're totally wrong, and that is what it looks like. We've been talking about the prospect that maybe there's some potential for like a progressive reform or something like that I was bringing up. Actually, I'd like to get your take on this. We're gonna have to go to a break in a few minutes, but we should have time. Talking with Lee Camp last hour about the idea of maybe even if Trump won a second term, if Trump had a victory in 2020, that possibly might be good for the Democrats, just because in 2016 they got pushed out. Bernie got pushed out, so the progressive wing of the Democrats, which is the future of it as far as I can tell, or at least as far as I thought, future of it got pushed out. But if 2020 is another loss, maybe the backers of the DNC would start to pull out of it too, because they don't see it getting them what they want. Maybe they'd push for some limited reform, and that would open up options for like something genuine. But if what you're saying is true, then that's definitely not going to happen. I don't think Buttigieg represents the progressive wing of the left. What's your take on that, Carmine?
A progressive wing, I don't think is going to get you the votes you need to get power. It's a fringe group. It is a fringe group. No matter what you see on the news, no matter what you see on the people, protesting, it's a fringe group. So,
do you think the protests are doing anything to shift the Overton window on that?
I think the protests are shifting, are firing up the right big time.
I can see that too. Yeah.
Let's take a break. We'll take one early, and we'll bring you back for the last 15, 16 minutes. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. The voice that you've been hearing is Carmen. Carmen, can you pronounce your last name Sabia? Is that right?
That's one of them.
Okay, fair enough. We'll be back in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Sabia for this segment and the last. We're talking with Carmine Sabia. He is the writer and editor at large at Sabia Report. You can check that out, sabiareport.com. Also, follow Carmine on Twitter at Carmine Sabia. I'll spell this out for you. It's CarmineSabia. Carmine Sabia, pretty much spelled like it sounds. Thanks again for joining us, Carmine. I wanted to get into some. Yeah, no, thank you. I wanted to get into something real quick. Looking at the election, talking about this stuff. You just brought up the idea that progressives might be smaller, they might be less influential than progressives themselves think. It seems like, I mean, especially from a lot of the guests we talked to on this show, the idea is that there's like a real grassroots base that has the numbers, even if it doesn't have the influence, and it's just that base is opinions or perspectives or views of things aren't being represented by the Democratic Party. But it sounds like from what you're saying, they're a little bit more marginal than they may think. And this may have applied in 2016. It seems to have applied a bit more in 2020, possibly. Do you think that Sanders, as a representative of the progressives, at least some of them, probably most, do you think that Sanders failed because the DNC pushed him out, or do you think he failed because he simply couldn't rally the support that his supporters assumed he did? What's your take on that, Carmine?
A little of both. It's a little of both. He was definitely hamstrung. I think Sanders is a unique person where he can rally people. You know, where people keep the flock, and he's a good speaker. You know, he's a great speaker, and he could fire people up and get them excited. That being said, I don't think the future progressives like your AOCs and your Omars have that. So.
Oh, I see what you mean. You're saying you don't believe that they have the ability to effectively get their ideas out in the same way that Sanders could basically get his ideas out and draw so many people to him.
Correct. I don't. I think there's a gigantic difference between the two. And
let me ask you, what do you think happens if Trump wins in the next election? Meaning, in 2020. Okay. Now, what happens, A, to Democrats, but also what goes on from the standpoint of policies that Trump pushes forward in the second term?
I think you'll see a much more relaxed President Trump. I think you'll see a much more. I think he'll really push for his agenda a lot more in the second term, and it really a lot's going to depend on what we're dealing with in the Senate. I think the Supreme Court will be conservative for at least a generation, which is, in my opinion, a great thing. Be nice to have the law upheld and not somebody's ideals. That would be cool. But I think that he has a great.
The Supreme Court is only ideals being upheld. I mean, the law is always a manipulative or a malleable item. That's why these guys fight so hard for it, right? I mean, like, you're not saying that a conservative Supreme Court is basically just reading the law in this kind of perfect way, and other people on the court aren't. Like, you don't believe. Let me ask it in these terms. Do you believe that Gorish, or for that matter, the gentleman that just died, Robert Scalia, do you believe that these guys were ideological actors, or do you think they were just reading the law almost in this kind of God's perspective of law? I'm trying to get to this notion that law is malleable in and of itself in the way that it's interpreted. I don't necessarily believe that a conservative Supreme Court is the one that reads it in the way it's supposed to be read. Or you can entirely disagree with that.
I do think they read it the way it's supposed to be read.
But
I think they're reading the content.
I guess, like for example, I give a perfect example. The vote for the election for George Bush and Al Gore. And the Supreme Court basically gives a ruling that is entirely an ideological ruling. Is that evidence of them being somewhat of an activist court that's a conservative court? Or is that, I'm trying to make this point that whether they're conservative or whether you call them liberal, they're still acting on these kind of ideological values, not necessarily reading the letter of the law.
Yeah, I mean, no. Look, I think what was the ideological part of that ruling? I guess.
Well, you could have let the vote go through. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. My thought is you could have let the vote go through. I mean, just let them recount. If it's that much of an issue, the Supreme Court instigated itself into the recount and stopped the recount. And if I am not mistaken, made the point that it couldn't be used for precedent for later on.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Here's the problem, and I think everybody with eyes can see this. Every time you recounted the votes, Al Gore was getting more votes and Bush was not. It was a total manipulation. The same thing they want to do with mail-in voting. It was a total manipulation. They were trying to rob an election, and Democrats are famous for it. They've done it before. Go look up the Kennedy election and Illinois. So the Democrats love to steal them an election, and that's exactly what they were trying to do in Florida, and it had to be stopped. And somebody had.
Is it possible? Is it possible, to any degree that's possible, that the reason why Al Gore started to gain on Bush was because Al Gore actually had more votes, and not meaning if you take it as a foregone conclusion that Democrats were trying to steal the vote total, that's why the shenanigans was taking place in Florida, as opposed to we actually don't know who was going to win that, and you let it just go for the count. It seems like you took the foregone conclusion that Democrats were trying to cheat in Florida as opposed to trying to get to the actual nub of who won that state. Because Democrats were alleging the exact same thing, by the way, from the standpoint of Bush and his brother being in office in Florida.
Sure. Well, I tend to judge things based on their history. And based on, I like to look at the history of a person. For instance, if I were to judge a criminal case, I would look at the history of the perpetrator. And so the history of the Democrat Party is to try to steal elections. It's a known history. And it's exactly what they were trying to do in Florida. Are you asking me if something's possible? It's possible. Are you sure it's possible? Anything's possible, but it's unlikely. What's likely is they were, yet again, trying to steal an election. And so, no, I don't think that was. I just don't think it was an ideological vote. I think it was a saving democracy vote. They would have recounted that day. Let me tell you something. This is what you're looking at right now. If Trump somehow, if there's a ton of mail-in voting in November and Trump wins, they're going to recount those mail-in ballots for 4 years. For 4 years, they'll recount them. They talk about not accepting the results of the election. These people haven't accepted the results of an election for 4 years. They're not going to start now.
No, I do agree with that part. I even agree with you that if Trump wins, they're going to say it was the Russians or the Chinese or some collaborative group that did it. So on that one, yes, I agree with that point. I'm trying to get to this nub of this idea, though, that Republicans don't try to steal elections and that this is something that's specific to Democrats. In the election coming up, for example, the interstate cross-check, do you believe that the voting ID laws that were passed, or for that matter, the getting people off of the voter rolls, you don't take those things as being ways in which a particular political party may try to steal an election? You take those things as just natural things of government that needs to be done in order to keep the vote total the way the vote total is.
I mean, I'm certainly not saying that never is. I'm not saying the Republicans' hands are totally clean. Don't misjudge me. I mean, I'm certainly saying that if they could steal an election, I guess they would. I don't think that they're as cunning and wise in that area as the Democrats. But
let me ask you this: what's your issue with mail-in voting? By the way, I don't quite get this one, even though this has become somewhat of a point of contention. In my head, voting should be ubiquitous. You should have as many people to vote as possible, especially if you're in a representative government. And you want the vote to be honest, you want it to be transparent, you want it to be accurate, but ultimately you want a fair accounting. And if Trump wins that, then Trump wins it. I have no issue with it. I don't like the fact that Democrats never accepted the results of the election. Can't stand it, because I think it undermines the presidency, not to mention the whining and complaining that the public, or that somehow Trump cheated in order to win. I think it's nonsense. They're using this foil of pushing of the Russian government undermining democracy itself to explain their own failures in the race. I agree with you. The impeachment thing was basically a soft coup. I think we even agree on that part. I think what we disagree, though, is on the mail-in voting. Why do you think mail-in voting, or why do you hold that with such contempt, as opposed to finding ways around the COVID-19 thing for people to vote?
There's already been problems with mail-in voting in certain states. Mail-in voting it would take a year. I mean, it would take, you know how long it would take to really count that? It's not.
Well, it depends on when the people get their voting things.
And nobody's going to say, people are getting voting ballots late in certain states already. Here's the thing. This country's not.
Yes, because Donald Trump has taken a policy on the post office to make them, or to get them to slow down how fast the mail is going out. He's been attacking them relentlessly. And the guy that he put in, DeJoy, is basically putting in policies that slows down the ability for those people to get their meds, or, in this case, for those people to get their ballots. I mean, Donald Trump was on Fox News the other day, basically saying he wants to withhold funds from the post office so Democrats, quote unquote, can't have universal mail-in voting.
Yeah, good.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. I think this is where we definitely disagree on, because I have no issue with mail-in voting. I want it to be honest. I want it to be accurate. I want to be able to have some kind of record where we can say this person did this. But I don't have an issue with it.
Won't be the problem, man. The people counting the votes are human beings with ideological thoughts and opinions. You can't escape that. And you're telling me that some of these liberals and conservatives, some of these people aren't so far baked into their side that they're going to ignore and disqualify votes that they really shouldn't, because they have an ideological difference and they have a perspective on who they want to win. These are human beings. It's not a machine.
Carmine, I actually have a quick question on this. We only have like a minute or two left, but we've been talking about this issue on and off. This is slightly tangential. We had somebody on from the USPS, actually, a spokesperson for the postal union in New York. We were talking with them about the USPS. Again, it's a slightly different conversation, but I wanted to come back on this. We've had people on to talk about this issue. We had a sort of unsuccessful interview with somebody who is giving more of the right-wing side of the argument, talking about fraud. I just want to get from you, while you're on, where would you go if people wanted to learn a little bit more about this, if they wanted to inspect the arguments for themselves? Where would you go to check out news on this stuff, or who are the sources you trust when it comes to accusations of voter fraud in the mail-in voting going on?
Well, honestly, I mean, Breitbart puts out a lot of stuff. Gateway Pundit puts out a lot of stuff. And people will say, well, they're far right-wing, they're this or that. But the stories they're reporting, they're linking back to local news sources in those areas that have reported it, but they haven't gotten national attention. So, Breitbart and the Gateway Pundit are two of the two that jump off the top of my head that are just, all they're doing is taking stories from local news sources and they're republishing them. So you can link to the local news sources yourselves.
You just go back and read the original story yourself, so you get to verify it for yourself. I get what you're saying.
Carmine, where can people find your work, by the way? We have about a minute and a half left. Where can people find your work, and what have you been covering recently?
Always covering, obviously I'm covering the election hardcore and the Black Lives Matter movement and the war against police. And you can check us out at SabiaReport.com, and you can also check me out at TheFederalistPapers.org.
Awesome. Hey, Carmine, thank you for joining us today. All right,
we're going to.
Yeah, thank you again for coming on. We're going to close it out here. Great interview with Carmine Sabia. Again, for those listening, that was Carmine Sabia, writer and editor at large at SabiaReport.com. You can follow him on Twitter at Carmine Sabia, spelled like it sounds. I don't need to do that again. Carmine Sabia. You can also watch the Carmine Sabia show by going to SabiaReport.com. We will be back tomorrow, coming back with our last show of the week tomorrow, 7 a.m. Eastern. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, I want to thank you for joining us for the show once again. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Really good show today. Really interesting topics and really interesting interviews. I'm always sometimes enamored by somebody saying someone in interviews like, what? Wait, did he just say that? And then at that point, you get to dig in a little bit, that type of stuff. But no, man, thank you for joining us for the show. We had a really good show. Tomorrow's going to be the end of the week. Shout out to all of our guests, Frost, Lee Camp, and the Carmine Sevilla. Yeah, great conversation for today. I read the first super chat, so I'm going to call it a day. I'm still not up to snuff from the previous surgery, but I do want to try to get some shows in today. So they've changed my device. My YouTube, when I woke up this morning and it came for the show, I noticed that YouTube had a different setup. And it took a while to figure out wait a minute. Okay, I see. Yeah, they've changed the setup for this stuff, so my screen looks differently now. But I will likely see you guys a little bit later today. I'm going to say like, share, subscribe, and I want to thank all of you for joining us. I'm just making sure I haven't missed anything. Let's see. This, and come on. I'm trying to see it now so I don't miss it. Okay. All right. Yeah, this ain't working. Come on. All right. I'm going to end this here. I'm going to say like, share, and subscribe. If there were any chats that were sent beyond the one that I mentioned this morning, I will find that chat and recount it later. But like, share, and subscribe. Thanks all.